The Futile Facade. Chapter 11. Harry looked up from Potions Quarterly with an unimpressed sigh when Archie burst into her room and shut the door loudly behind him. He leaned against it, looking slightly out of breath, and she half expected him to drag a piece of furniture across the frame. For a moment, a much younger Archie transposed himself from memory over her 14-year-old cousin. A bittersweet smile twisted her lips. In 4 years, her cousin had both changed entirely and not changed at all. "She won't take no for an answer," Archie panted. His eyes were wide in his head and bright like a cornered animal's. "Lily," she guessed, flipping a page unconcernedly. Her mother had been wheedling Archie about giving her a duel since they returned from school. She'd been polishing her skills with rumours since the World Cup, but after hearing how well the third task went, Lily wanted to test Archie's ability for herself. He flopped dramatically down onto her bed, and she hastily rescued a cup of tea balanced near her foot from certain doom. "This is the 4th time this week she's asked. I told her I get enough of that in the tournament, but I think she can tell I don't really mean it." "Just keep putting her off," Harry said after draining the tea. "There are only 2 more days until the end of break." Archie's face scrunched in distress. "I hate this." She closed the magazine slowly, sensing that he was referring to something more than her mother's persistent badgering. Archie's gaze was on the ceiling, but the pain in his eyes was for something else. Harry reached out to run a hand through Archie's hair, grown out to Rigel's length but not quite as unruly. "Today I realized, we're halfway through." He turned his head on the covers to blink at her. "Halfway? Huh. That's," he broke off, unable to articulate what, exactly, it was. After a long moment, he settled for another, "Huh. It's strange, I know. When we started this, even though the idea was to make it all 7 years, I don't know if I really thought we'd ever get this far," she confessed. "And now? Do you think we can last another 3.5 years?" Archie asked. "I don't know that we have another option," she said quietly. "They'd have to make a dramatic change to get out of the ruse, now. It wouldn't be as simple as switching back. There were too many differences between their personas. A dozen people would realize in the first week that Archie wasn't Rigel and she wasn't Harry." It was a comical thought, almost. Their original lives were all but closed to them until school was through. As Archie's face screwed up again, she offered hastily, "If you wanted to give it up, though, I would find a way, Arch." A hollow-sounding laugh escaped him. "Yeah. What exactly could you do?" She swallowed. Nothing great came to mind. Rigel was bound by the unbreakable vow to finish out the tournament. Until the end of the year, at least, nothing short of actual death would release her from the ruse. Archie could run away somewhere, if Harry faked an illness, a sabbatical of some kind, maybe. She didn't think he'd be happier somewhere other than AIM if he couldn't be himself, though. "I could pretend to get pregnant," she suggested half-heartedly. Archie snorted. "That would raise some eyebrows. It would give me an excuse to leave AIM, but I'd just end up back home. Eventually, it would become clear that I wasn't, in fact, pregnant. Or you. You could use your morphing to mimic it for a while, though," she said. At his flat look, she grimaced. "I know, it's a bad idea. You'd have to pretend until I got home for the summer." He ran a hand over his face and nodded tiredly. "It's just as well," he said on a sigh. "Hermione is coming back to AIM now that her part in the tournament is over. I'd rather be where she is." "How is Hermione?" she asked. She'd grown rather fond of the girl in the few months they'd interacted. Harry loved her Hogwarts friends, but none of them really understood or even bothered to notice the inequality and injustice beyond the world that cocooned them. "She wanted me to tell you she hasn't given up on the Fade. You'll probably get letters every week. Also, she's hoping you or Delacour win the tournament," Archie told her. Her head tilted. "Not Jacob Owens." Archie smirked. "She thinks he's a disgrace to Muggleborns everywhere. I believe she called him a blood narrative swallowing, party-line regurgitating collaborator." He sighed in admiration. "Hermione is so uncompromisingly principled." Harry tried not to let the sympathy show too strongly on her face. Archie had it bad. The way he'd lost his good sense at the Yule Ball was proof enough that time away from the brilliant brown-eyed girl hadn't dimmed the torch he carried a whit. What would he do when they inevitably did have to switch back? Would he feel free to woo her as himself, or would it be too late by then? Given the way Hermione had felt comfortable confiding in Rigel about her conflicting feelings for Harry, she had to wonder if she hadn't inadvertently put Archie as himself firmly in the friend category before he'd even had a chance. "I'll be fine at AIM," Archie eventually said into the silence between them. "Like you said, we're already halfway done. It doesn't make sense to quit now. How are you, though?" She frowned. "I'll be better when this tournament is over. If I never see Riddle's face again, it'll be too soon." She hesitated before saying anything further, but Archie knew her too well to be fooled by the blank expression on her face. "What is it?" he asked. "I think there's something shady going on in the lower alleys." "What else is new?" She shook her head. "Not the usual stuff. The other day I heard the name, Voldemort." Archie gaped at her, then sat up and rounded on her fully. "The diary construct. And you're just now telling me this?" His face closed in concerned worry and he chewed on his lip. "What are we going to do?" She hitched her mouth in a weak grimace. The truth was, she didn't know whether there was anything they could do. "I sent an anonymous tip to Dad's office, but the vow I made to Riddle after second year prevents me from saying too much." Aside from Ginny, Archie was the only exception from the vow. She'd told him everything before the Malfoys' garden party, and hadn't considered it misleading since Riddle was under the impression that Archirus Black knew in any case. What Archie didn't know, what she wasn't certain how to explain, was that she was also bound by the Thief's Code. She couldn't betray anyone who pledged to the Court of Rogues to the Ministry. The trouble was, she didn't know all of the people that entailed. It seemed unlikely that Crouch Jr. would be paying tithe in the lower alleys, but until she could catch Leo long enough to ask him, Harry couldn't be sure. "I wrote there was an aspiring Dark Lord gathering followers in the alleys. Maybe that'll be enough to catch one of the recruiters, and one could lead to more. It might be wishful thinking. How could the Aurors find one shady bloke in a hub for shady blokes?" "You said before that it might come after you, if it survived," Archie reminded her. She inclined her head grimly. "I haven't spent much time in the alleys since I heard that name. At Hogwarts, I'll be safe. Next summer, though, you'll have to start being very careful. After all, it's really Rigel Black the thing has a grudge against, not Harry Potter." "Sorry," she added. Archie waved her off. "You can't take responsibility for the actions of every psychopath in your life, Harry." After a moment of contemplation, he added, "It's kind of messed up that there are enough of those to warrant a blanket rule, actually." He sank back into the covers again and stared at the ceiling with furrowed brows. "Closest fire to the house is the tournament," he murmured. "Once you extinguish that one, we can worry about the next." Harry tentatively agreed, though privately she suspected Riddle's ambitious amalgamation of warped magic and teenage angst would prove to be the larger firestorm in the long run. A tournament she could handle. -0. HP. -0. The train rattled comfortably along beneath her feet, its steady sprint across the countryside at once familiar and soothing. Students in her year group called her name in greeting as she walked down the central corridor. Younger ones waved or stared shyly and upperclassmen gave her friendly nods. Rigel tried to return the acknowledgements casually, but she knew her cheeks carried flags of color to announce her embarrassment to any who looked too closely. She marveled at the difference between this train ride and the first, 3.5 years before, which she'd spent with her chin tucked into her collar, convinced that anyone who glanced at her profile would immediately discover her secret. Her friends chorused in pleasure when she slid the compartment door open, and Theo jumped up with Millicent to help her hoist her trunk into the overhead rack. Draco took the book out of the seat they'd saved between him and Pansy, and Rigel sank into a feeling of utter belonging so pure it could only have been distilled from years of true companionship. "How was everyone's break?" she asked, unable to help the contented smile on her lips. "We've already been through our holidays," Theo said, waving a hand dramatically. "Tell us about yours instead." Rigel shrugged. "Mine was quiet. Spent time with the family and just relaxed." "How is your cousin?" Pansy asked. She had a round of embroidery in her lap, and Rigel eyed it curiously before answering. "Harry is fine. And Addie is as tall as my knee, if you meant her. She even talks a bit." "What are you making, Pan. Pansy dropped her eyes to the burgeoning design. I think it's a heart. Or an onion. She sighed. Mother wants me to pursue a few feminine hobbies, to impress the suitors. I'm to charm it into a throw pillow after I finish, but I'm told the most gentle ladies complete the actual embroidery by hand first. What a waste of time, Draco said, flicking his eyes sharply to the side in the way that indicated he was trying not to roll them completely. It was either this or knitting, Pansy said with a moue of displeasure. Theo guffawed. Does Lady Parkinson think suitors want women well suited to grandmotherhood? Put it away, she won't know. I got a new set of exploding snap cards for you. He pulled out the shiny pack and tossed it invitingly up and down in his hand. Clearly tempted, Pansy slipped her needle into the edges of the round and said, Don't anyone tell her I neglected it. You should just bribe a younger student to do it for you, Millicent said. She pulled the fold-up table out of the side of the compartment and opened the flaps. That green grass chit sews in the common room sometimes. Astoria. Pansy gave up pretending to clutch the embroidery and propped it in the windowsill. I think she needle points. Same thing, Millicent muttered. Theo set up the first game. Blaze, you playing? The quiet dark-skinned boy looked up for the first time from his notebook. No, thank you. I'm working on a puzzle my mother set me over break. Millicent glanced over at the notes he'd scribbled and said, Runes. Don't you get enough of that at school? This is more interesting than the problems Professor Sinistra assigns. To soften the subtle brag, Blaze added, it's not tailored to whatever concept we're covering in the textbook, at least. Pansy made a noise of interest. I know what you mean, Blaze. Sometimes I wonder whether I'm learning anything beyond how to be a good student of magic. The practicality of real life rarely fits so neatly in a framework of concepts, does it? Application is key, Blaze agreed distractedly. Seeing that he was too invested in his puzzle to carry the conversation further, Pansy let him be. Rigel, are you playing? She hadn't played in months. Sure, deal me in, Rigel said, pulling out her wand. The game began, and Rigel let herself relax into it. All 5 of them were fairly skilled, so it was several rounds of matches before any of the cards reached the danger zone. Theo shuffled faster, trying to get a match before Wendelin the Weird started smoking. Come on, Draco muttered, chin propped in his hand and foot bouncing restlessly. Millicent's wand darted forward, but it was for a different set of matches, and Wendelin began to tremor. Pansy let out a nervous noise as she made an aborted forward movement. It was only Runsky, though, not a match. The explosion was inevitable, and should have produced nothing but a harmless flinch from the lot of them. Something about the tense atmosphere had seeped into Rigel unconsciously without her realizing it, however. When the card swelled with power preparing to burst, her magic flooded it instinctually, instantly dooding the impending explosion. Anticipation whooshed out of the room like air from a punctured balloon as her friends stared at her incredulously. Theo poked the now dormant card and frowned. You broke it. That's cheating, Rigel. She looked down at her wand sitting innocently in her lap, as though she could blame the sensitive tool for her magic's actions. My bad, she said. They gathered the cards so Theo could deal again, but nervous energy had taken root in Rigel's blood. Every time a card flared with magic she had to tamp down on her own to keep it from lashing out and ruining the game. After the 3rd time she wasn't fast enough to stop the unconscious reaction consciously. Theo put away the deck with a shake of his head. Your reflexes are monstrous, he said, half admonishing and half admiring. Don't tell me you're going to be this high-strung forever. Rigel grimaced. She'd thought she was very relaxed. Perhaps she had forgotten what true relaxation even felt like, after so much time spent on near-constant alert. Sorry, she said again. Don't apologize, Draco said quietly. Those reflexes have saved you from a number of injuries this year. Keep them sharp. We can always play again when this is all over. She smiled weakly, hoping he was right. She wanted to look forward to a normal that was possible to get back to. Cheer up, Rigel, Millicent said bracingly. You look like a glum ghost. She made a face, and Pansy said, he looks more like a put-out poltergeist. Sensing a challenge, the others were quick to join in. A sad spectre, Theo suggested. An abject apparition. A sorrowful spirit. A forlorn phantom, Draco tried. That isn't a true alliteration, Rigel pointed out. You come up with one for phantom, then. Her friend huffed. A pitiful phantom, she wrinkled her nose. Well, that was a bad noun pick. How about gloomy gull? A miserable manifestation, Millicent said, a proud grin tucked into her cheek. A wretched wraith, Pansy countered. You, good one, Theo said. He stuck his tongue between his teeth, then offered, a sorry shade. A sour spook. Something phantasm, Draco muttered, clicking his tongue in annoyance when he couldn't come up with anything. Why do you pick the hardest ones? Pansy asked, laughing. The blonde boy threw up his hands. There's nothing else left. Soul, presence, shadow. Shut up, Blaze. Blaze, who had evidently not been so wrapped up in his work as they assumed, smiled slyly. It appears the long winter break has softened your mind, Draco. I'll soften your face, Draco threatened half-heartedly. Blaze had already turned back to his notebook. Rigel just smiled, watching them all interact so freely. She'd missed her friends, despite wanting nothing more at the end of term than to get away from everything. Millicent ruined the moment by asking, what have you deduced about the fourth task so far? She blinked at the other girl. I haven't thought about it at all. Bagman and Crouch said we won't find out until a few days beforehand. Millicent and Pansy exchanged amused glances. You can't just wait for information to come to you, Rigel, Pansy said patiently. Millie and I have been proactive over the break. My second cousin is engaged to the niece of the, you don't care. Millicent cut herself off as Rigel's eyes glazed over against her will. The point is, one of the task creators let it slip that the fourth task is some kind of scavenger hunt. You'll have to find things within a set time limit. What sorts of things? She asked. No idea, the dark-haired girl confessed. But each blood champion is to be assigned a different set of items. You won't be in direct competition, except for the time. That was somewhat comforting. After the third task, Rigel didn't want to go head-to-head with anyone unless she absolutely had to. She'd been hoping to focus on other things until the task was officially announced. Now, however, she had a responsibility to begin preparation for some sort of retrieval task. Rigel knew Millicent just wanted her to succeed, but part of her wished her friend could have waited a few days before telling her. All she said was, thanks. I appreciate you keeping an ear to the ground for me. At Millicent's knowing look, she added, really, I do. I'll brush up on my locating spells this week. Anything on the political front I should know about? Her friends tried to politely stifle their expressions, but only Blaze was successful, and it was difficult to tell whether he was even listening any longer. You're talking about the marriage law? Pansy clarified. It won't be voted on until the end of the spring session. Both sides are ramping up the public information campaigns. In the meantime, it helps that the half-blood everybody is talking about right now is gorgeous and utterly unthreatening, Draco said, cynicism in every syllable. Realizing he meant Delacour, she frowned. Was that the reason Riddle had so carefully ensured the weaker girl would beat out Antiope to the finals? The part Vila undoubtedly made a more attractive advertisement for marrying half-bloods than the fearsome, uncompromisingly capable Athena. Is there any angle Riddle isn't working? She muttered. He seems to be having trouble with yours, actually, Pansy said. I've been winning the tournament for him, Rigel disagreed. Can't get much more pure-blood supremacy than that. Millicent and Theo winced, but it was Blaze who responded. You could, actually. Of all the participants, you're the one who has been the least vocal in support of the new Triwizard tournament. It's obvious to anyone watching that you'd rather be anywhere else and you don't agree with the premise. Even the Muggleborns are better champions of the spectacle than you. It wasn't exactly a compliment, but something in Rigel's stomach thrummed in satisfaction. It's only obvious to those paying attention to the politics, Theo disagreed. Most people are watching for the blood and glory. Millicent reached over to whack the boy upside the head. Don't tell him that. Rigel sighed. I suppose Theo is right, though. Only a few people watching will consider what the tournament really means. Those are the only people who matter, Draco said soothingly. You only think that because those people include you, Theo muttered. The common people matter, 2. They can start riots and make things difficult for the upper crust. They also have thoughts and emotions and valid human experiences, Blaze said dryly. Sure, maybe. Theo shrugged. The point is, disregard their lust for fear and blood at your peril. Enough with the blood. Millicent groaned. You're not helping. Theo blinked at her. Helping what? I thought we were just talking. Draco pinched the bridge of his nose with a low curse and even Pansy sighed. Rigel chuckled. Let's talk about something else, instead. What else have you all been up to? Theo, why don't you tell Rigel about your winter break? Draco suggested swiftly. There was an unkind edge to his tone. The sandy-haired boy's face darkened momentarily. He cleared his throat and said, there isn't much to tell. Well, Zack and I broke up, but what can you expect with his family dripping a constant stream of poison in his ears? We never had a chance. He gave a dramatic sigh and said, think Alden will let me cry on his shoulder about it this term. Rigel let out a surprised laugh. Rosier, she asked, incredulous. Theo waggled his eyebrows at her. He's fit as anything, don't tell me you haven't noticed. She grimaced. Somehow, Rosier's looks were always eclipsed by his confounding personality and deliberately obtuse intentions. You may have some competition, Theo Pansy said slowly. I saw Alden in a very engrossing discussion with Rigel's cousin at the ball. Her eyes sharpened. She'd forgotten, but Pansy was right. Archie had been speaking to Rosier for a brief time. Did you hear what they were talking about? She asked Pansy. The blonde girl paused delicately before saying, I believe it was about the marriage law, actually. Rigel stared at her. You're joking. Pansy gave a helpless lift of her shoulder. I don't know the whole of it, but, well, is it so surprising? In the current political climate, there's a good chance the law will pass. It's smart to test the waters now. My parents are even looking at a few half-bloods for my own prospects, she admitted. More and more, the well-positioned ones are going to be seriously considered. Rigel scowled. I don't care how smart it is. No one should be considering Harry. She's spoken for. After the spectacle she made of her affections for the American muggle born at the ball, you can't be surprised that people have figured out your engagement isn't in earnest, Millicent said gently. At Rigel's frustrated frown, she shook her head. Really, you can't protect her forever, Rigel. I certainly can, she muttered. Draco changed the subject abruptly to whether the others had managed to finish their holiday assignments or not, and Rigel let the conversation drift away from her. Why hadn't Archie mentioned his conversation with Rosier? Had it seemed unimportant to him, or had the emotional distraction of being in proximity to Hermione again pushed the interaction to the back burner? She supposed it didn't matter why he hadn't told her. Rigel still had to decide what to do about it. If Rosier thought he could sweep in like some kind of hero and save Harry from the marriage law, he would shortly be divorced from that idea. She had no intention of entertaining pureblood suitors keen on snapping up the well-connected half-bloods as soon as the law went through. And the law is not going through, she added with a mental growl. Do you mind keeping your angst to a dull roar? With an internal jolt, Rigel recognized Dom's voice echoing in her ears. I wasn't talking to you, she thought at him. You, me, what's the difference? I'm just asking you not to shout down the stars in here. Sorry, she offered, a bit put out to be apologizing for the thoughts in her own head. It's not as though she enjoyed the fact that he was privy to them. I heard that. With a silent snort of amusement, she glanced around the compartment and saw that the others were engaged in a lively debate over the diplomatic effect of the tournament on Magical Britain's foreign relations. Figuring they could do without her for a short while, she settled back into her seat and closed her eyes. She was by now used to barreling her way through the storm at the edges of her mind. Dom met her in the cozy heart of her mountainscape, a mug of hot cocoa in hand. The marshmallows oscillated weirdly from the bottom of the cup to the top, as though they couldn't decide whether to float or not, but otherwise it was a passable imitation. How's your work progressing? She asked after settling into one of the armchairs by the fireplace. Dom, garbed in a padded housecoat with matching slippers, put a pipe between his teeth and took a long pull before blowing the smoke out in a thoughtful stream. His bit of theatre complete, he said, very well, thank you for inquiring. I've finished with the last portion you gave me. He pulled a sphere of her magic from his pocket and tossed it toward her. She caught it, though a bit of cocoa dribbled down the side of her cup. Her magic clung to her with a prickling that was almost like static electricity. She squeezed it gently in a sort of one-armed hug, steadfastly ignoring Dom's amused smirk, and, with a thought, sent it zooming back to her space room to join the mass of magic that had already been sifted through. A rough mental catalogue of what remained surprised her. "You're almost finished," she said, not hiding the relief in her voice. "That's good. I found out he can still perceive the magic, even though it's separated from him. Riddle can identify me without touching my skin if I'm nearby." Dom raised his eyebrows. "This enemy of yours is more powerful than you've led me to believe." She stared at him. "I told you, he's the most powerful politician in the country." "Political power does not always equate to actual power," he said. "You've seen all my memories of him," she reminded him. "How could you not understand how powerful he is? I've seen him destroy some furniture and let out a bit of power to intimidate a 13-year-old. Dom corrected her. "This is something else. How far away can he perceive the bit of magic in you?" "I haven't extensively tested it," she said stiffly. "You should." She shook her head. "No point. As soon as you've gathered it all, I'm going to get rid of it." He frowned. "Are you sure that's wise? We may be able to find a better use for it. Releasing it into the world would just allow it to flow back to him. What if you could reverse his intention and use this magic to track the rest of him instead?" "I'd rather be rid of it." "Wait, what do you mean flow back to him? Wouldn't it just dissipate into the universe?" Dom tapped his pipe on the edge of his armchair slowly. "Not necessarily. If he has such a strong connection to his magic that it remains identifiable as his even after intermingling with yours, and if he were close enough when you released it, there's a chance it would find its way back to him. The lesser part will always be attracted to the whole." She thought about the way the pieces of her magic she separated from her own core required a stern inflection of will to keep from fusing back together within her mindscape. Is that true for all magic? Can it come back after being cast if the original core is close enough? If the magic can cause noticeable resonance at a short distance, then it retains the intrinsic qualities that make it yours. Such magic can be reabsorbed. Do your potions cause resonance when you hold them? Dom asked rhetorically. No. That would have been hard to miss. Spells are much the same, he said, nodding. Once you force your magic into such a shape, it loses the ability to meld back into your core smoothly. You could unravel the shape, I suppose, and something in the magic that remains might be recognizably yours once more, but it would require a great deal of effort. Have you ever seen a magical work unraveled? I don't think so. It's not a usual application, though. Nothing like it had ever been mentioned in any of her reading or classes, at least. Nothing about this is usual, Dom said, waving his pipe for emphasis. Don't bind yourself to the limits others accept without question. You're finally almost free of this interloper's influence. It's time to explore your magic's true nature. She frowned. What do you mean? Has it calmed down without Riddle's magic? She hadn't noticed any significant difference since Dom began the filtration process, but she could always hope. He tilted his head consideringly. I wouldn't say it's calmer, exactly. Your magic will never be entirely tame, dear. It does seem noticeably nicer, however, also younger, more impetuous. Like a wild horse, but without the burr in its blanket. He smiled wide and slow. Perhaps it's time to try a full gallop. If only I had somewhere to gallop to, she said drolly. Dom shrugged, artful indifference that she didn't believe for a moment. One day you will, and I'll be ready with your tack and saddle. Rigel set aside her cocoa and stood with a sigh. The delusions of grandeur are my cue to go. Can't buck your destiny forever, he said calmly. She shoved the mental equivalent of an eye roll at him and retreated from the inner recesses of her mind. Rigel might be grateful to him for maintaining the different levels of her mind and combing Riddle's magic out of her core, but that didn't mean she had to humor his unsolicited ambitions. -0. HP. -0. The sun took its long, slow dive into the horizon and the train settled with a groaning sigh at the Hogsmeade platform. Students poured from the contraption like rats from a sinking ship. Rigel made her way with the others toward the carriages, but before she could follow Pansy and Draco into one, her elbows were captured in twin traps that spun her in a circle. "Puppy! You're riding with us." Rigel sent her friends an apologetic smile, and it was a testament to dozens of similar situations that they merely waved her off with promises to save her a seat at the feast. Fred and George towed her to the next carriage along the line and opened the door, only to find it occupied. "It is you." Fleur Delacour sat on the left bench, Bose Baton's uniform perfectly pressed and hands folded demurely in her lap. "Our apologies, milady," Fred said with a flourishing bow. George copied him, adding, "We had no inkling this conveyance was spoken for." Delacour tilted her chin at the empty seats. "We are all going to Z.E. Castle, no?" The twins exchanged several sentences in a glance, then grinned. To the lady's insistence. "We defer." Rigel found herself boosted unnecessarily into the carriage and took the seat next to Delacour with what little dignity she could scrounge after the twins' manhandling. "How was your holiday, Delacour?" she asked politely. "Not too different from yours, I dare say," Delacour said with a pretty shrug. "Always questions about Z.E. tournament." "At least I got to see my sister." Rigel nodded. "I know what you mean. It seems we won't really escape it until this year is over." Delacour sent her a hard-to-read look beneath her silvery lashes. "Someone will not escape it even then." A pang hit her stomach. She kept forgetting the purported grand prize. Rigel was prevented from further comment by the slamming of the carriage door and the rocking jolt that came as the Thestral shot forward. "So, to business," George said, clapping his hands briskly. Fred nodded along solemnly. "As your official PR reps, we've been considering how to help your public image bounce back from the hit it took during the third task." "Honestly, Rigel, blood magic." George's face said plainly that he thought better of her. Rigel grimaced. "Well, yeah. At the time, it had seemed inspired. In retrospect, she perhaps should have put stricter limits on herself prior to stepping into the ring." Fred reached over to pat her knee gently. "Not to worry, pup, we have a plan. Winning hearts and minds. Projecting an image of youth and innocence. It's all very simple, really." "Really?" Rigel offered a skeptical look. The twins grinned unabashed. "Pranks," they chorused. She raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure that isn't your innate prankster bias talking?" George looked offended. "I'm sure we wouldn't know if it was. Clearly there's no way we could, and therefore we can only proceed with perfect clarity," Fred assured her. "Pranks?" Delacour moved her eyes between the three of them incredulously. "He has a tournament to focus on." Fred smiled reassuringly, and it was not at all reassuring. "This is directly related. Tournament scores are irrelevant if no one wants you to win. Public support will influence the judges," George added hastily as Delacour looked ready to argue. "Amazing that the three finalists are all good-looking, well-spoken, and entertaining to watch, isn't it?" "Not at all, Gred." "Quite right, Forge." Delacour's scowl melted away and thoughtfulness replaced it. "Antiope should have advanced," she admitted quietly. "If she had been more charming, ze may have put her in a different spot for ZE duels. People enjoy cheering for those they admire on a personal level even more than the players that are simply good at the game," George concluded. The expression on his face was gentle, but it clearly communicated that he agreed with Delacour's assessment of the third task. "So you see," Fred said earnestly, "it's really, positively vital that you take our advice. For the sake of your reputation, your popularity, and your viability in the tournament as a whole." Rigel wasn't convinced. "How would pulling a conspicuous prank make people admire me?" she asked. "If Delacour's reaction is standard, then most people will take it as a sign of arrogance that I do anything other than prepare seriously for the tasks ahead." The redheads traded pitying looks. George shook his head. "Rigel, Rigel, Rigel. What is the fastest way to a man's heart?" "Between the fourth and fifth ribs," she drawled. Fred wagged a finger at her. "None of that. And no more blood magic. We're going for charming and kind-hearted Rigel, not mop the stage with the boy who hurt his friend Rigel." "We're sort of a package deal," she said, amused. George waved a hand unconcernedly. People can only see one side of things at a time, so, let's show them your fun side. And the answer to my esteemed colleague's question was food, Rigel. Food is the fastest way to a man's heart, Fred clarified. My mistake. She smiled sweetly. We should have rescued Puppy from Slytherin before things got this bad, George confided in his brother's ear. If he refuses the prank, we'll know for sure he's going dark. Rigel scowled. Let's hear it then, wise masters of publicity. Doctorates, actually, Fred said, almost absently. Delacour muffled a chuckle, but Rigel didn't give them the satisfaction. After all this build-up, it had better be a pretty terrific prank. George cleared his throat. Fred produced a detailed blueprint of the great hall and the kitchens beneath. They explained. Rigel's eyes narrowed, then grew wide. Delacour hid an admiring sigh behind one delicate hand. In the end, there was only one thing she could say. The Marauders are going to be erased from the annals of history. Doctors Weasley have ascended. -0. HP. -0. Settling back into an academic routine felt like trying to fit into a coat she'd nearly outgrown. After the relative freedom of study the break offered, forcing her attention to the topics her professors required was difficult. The only exception was her lessons with Snape. Rigel fell back into free brewing as easily as fish slipped into a stream. As their evening lessons progressed, Rigel became more decisive. She got faster at choosing ingredient combinations and orders, but was also quicker to make mistakes as a result. Each mistake taught her more than following a dozen recipes correctly ever could have. Knowing what reactions were intellectually likely and watching them unfold in real time were very different levels of knowledge. Sometimes she could counteract the problem as it unfolded, but other times she realized too late what she ought to have done sooner. That, too, was a valuable kind of learning. Her protective apron was still pristine, something that at turns fascinated and frustrated her head of house. He seemed to take some amused affront at the unstained garment, but it was hardly Rigel's fault. A dirty apron might be the sign of a daring innovator, but her magic reacted too swiftly to allow any impending explosions to gain steam. When another night passed and Rigel hung her spotless protective gear on its hook once more, Snape gave a wry twist of his lips as he commented, "If ever your effects hang in the National Potions Archive, no one will ever believe their authenticity. Proof of my preeminence will fade into legend, but you and I will always know the truth." She grinned. Snape met her grin with a sneer. "Pray your mythology remains as unstained as your apron." "What cynicism," she said, fighting a laugh. "I suppose I should follow your example and preemptively sour my own reputation, is that it?" Surprised offense looked out at her from his dark eyes. "My reputation is beyond reproach in our community." Silently savoring the phrase "our community," Rigel clarified. "Your professional reputation is immaculate, true, but a man's mythology is more than just his work alone. People are just as fascinated and intimidated by your personal character, sir." For the most part, she was joking. It was fun to see the unflappable potions master flustered for a change. "I've always wondered, did you deliberately cultivate the aura of mysterious genius or does it come naturally?" "What rubbish," the man muttered, a dark scowl deeply at home on his face. "My theory has been that it is mostly natural, but that you also happen to enjoy thwarting the shallow curiosity of the fickle masses at every turn," she continued blithely. Her mentor snorted. "Now who's cynical?" "I learn from the best," Rigel agreed. "And yet I've apparently neglected to teach you when to shut your mouth." His words came out on a growl, but she could tell by the dismissive way he shooed her out the door that he wasn't truly upset. "Get out of here before I remember my original impulse to pickle your organs and be done with it." She turned back with a frown. "Wait, when did you?" The door shut firmly in her face. She clucked her tongue doubtfully. "Human organs aren't even that useful," she muttered as she began the winding walk back toward the common room. He'd probably just put them on display to intimidate first years. She fell silent as she walked, mentally cataloguing the things she still had to do that week. Out of the silence there came the steady click of expensive shoes on stone floors, and as she merged with the main corridor that led from the stairs, she crossed paths with Rookwood and Rosier. By the way Rosier's step faltered slightly at her appearance, Rigel guessed she hadn't imagined how he'd been avoiding her since the beginning of term. Her eyes narrowed. "Evening, gentlemen." "Rigel." Rookwood inclined his head politely. "How fortuitous our paths should meet." "Yes, what are the odds?" Rosier drawled, giving his best friend a measuring look. "I believe Pansy mentioned you'd been looking for us." Rookwood continued evenly. In step with the older boys now, Rigel could see the mischief glinting in the tall upperclassman's eyes. She smiled, a small, sharp thing. "It was really Alden I wanted to speak with." "You don't say?" Rookwood made a noise of contemplation like a mountain shifting its weight. "Well, why don't I leave you to it?" As he lengthened his stride and easily pulled ahead of them, Rigel reflected that he must always be slowing his gait to keep pace with Rosier. Rosier mouthed the word traitor to his friend's receding back, but turned with an attempt at charm to say, "Rigel, it's been too long. I trust you aren't finding the new year too arduous." "Not as yet," she said mildly. "You know how it is, though. One little inconvenience can snowball when you least expect it. I find it best to deal with small problems before they become larger, don't you?" "Ah, well, it depends," Rosier said. He cleared his throat and offered a wry smile. "If the snowball rolls down the hill and into your neighbor's yard, you don't have to deal with it at all, do you?" Rigel tilted her head, the sharp smile never faltering. "I've never been the type to let other people handle problems I am capable of squashing myself." The golden-eyed boy winced, and his lips silently repeated squashing with an uneasy glance at her expression. Rigel wondered with a morbid kind of self-recrimination whether he was remembering her rather violent showing in the third task. It disturbed her to think that people who once condescended to her might now be a little bit afraid of what she could do, but in that moment, she was willing to use whatever tactic worked. To her mild surprise, Rosier collected himself with a slow roll of his shoulders and paced to the edge of the corridor, where he could lean against the hard stone and cross his arms. Despite the defensive regrouping, he met her gaze squarely as she followed him over. When she was close enough that neither had to raise their voices above a low murmur, he said, "This is about your cousin, yes?" "Glad to be done dancing around it," Rigel nodded. "I want you to stay away from her." Rosier's eyebrows rose at her blunt declaration. After a slow blink, he said, respectfully, "Rigel, shouldn't that be her decision?" "What did she say at the ball, then?" she asked, a knowing tone in her voice. "Did she seem at all interested in your proposal?" Astonishment crept into his bright eyes, followed by a flicker of understanding that he seemed to seize upon. A grin tugged at his mouth and he said, "She didn't tell you? Did you have to hear about it from Pansy?" Rigel's annoyance spiked at his smug amusement. "I honestly doubt Harry considered your conversation worth mentioning." That wiped the humor from Rosier's face. "How interesting that you considered it worth stalking me for, then." "My cousin can be a bit naive," she said easily. "While I don't doubt she dismissed your attentions out of hand, she doesn't know how persistent you can be, Alden. So here we are. Regardless of how your conversation went, I'm telling you now to leave Harry alone." Rosier tilted his head back and stared at the torchlight as it played across the ceiling. "Don't you even want to know what we spoke of, first?" "Not particularly," Rigel said honestly. She could imagine well enough Rosier's enigmatic overtures and Archie's bemused unconcern. "Why so hostile?" Rosier complained. "I thought you'd be glad." "You thought I'd be glad, so you avoided me for 2 weeks." His gaze flicked down to meet hers guiltily. "Well, Pansy may have warned me after your outburst on the train." "Outburst?" Rigel rolled her eyes. Why did everyone act like she was crazy for wanting to keep Harry out of their calculations? Rosier grimaced. "I really didn't mean to upset you, Rigel. You know I value our friendship." He lifted a hand as though he would make a gesture, but then let it go limp at his side again. "Listen, Rookwood and I heard about the law going through committee, same as everyone else. My parents are better connected than most, however, and significantly worse at keeping secrets." He took a slow breath, as though preparing to do something he knew he'd regret. "What they told me, what no one else will be saying out loud yet, is that matches between party purebloods and half-bloods are not going to be left to chance." She stared at him, startled, for the moment, out of her anger. "What does that mean?" "There is an arithmancy algorithm," he said quietly, his voice nearly a whisper. Lord Riddle has been working on it for some time. My parents say he will match the scions of the old families to optimum candidates. They didn't understand it well enough to explain everything, but their impression is that Lord Riddle can calculate which matches will result in the most powerful offspring. The older a line is, the more important it is that they conform to his plans. Do you understand, Rigel? Rigel felt herself shake her head slowly. Her mind was reeling. She'd already figured out Riddle's law was at least partly an attempt to slow the declining dark wizard population. That he had gone so far as to plan exact marriages between actual children should not have surprised her, but somehow the fresh reminder of the man's pathological need for absolute control hit her like a bucket of cold water. That crazy mind-buggering bastard, she hissed when words came back to her at last. A wordless growl escaped her before she tamped down on the pure fury boiling in her veins and snapped her attention back to the concern at hand. But no, I don't understand. Harry isn't in the party and she isn't a pure blood. He can't control who she marries. So why are you dragging her into this? Rosia's expression moved through genuine confusion, then realization, and settled on pity. Rigel, you brought her into this. It's not her prospects Riddle will want to control. It's me. Rigel closed her eyes as the truth swooped down on her. The Blacks are one of the oldest lines. Of course he's thought up an optimum candidate for me. It's not Harry, I take it. Rosia shrugged helplessly. I don't know who, but you have to admit, the odds of it being her, out of everyone, are low. I know you won't let Riddle dictate something like that without a fight, he added before she could assert just that. He's outmaneuvered you before, though. The words were said gently, but Rigel felt them like a slap. She ran a hand through her hair and took a shaky breath. An algorithm. How was she supposed to predict something like that? After this year, he has no hold on me, she said. She tried to believe it, as though a strong enough conviction could make it so. I hope you're right, Rosia said. If you're wrong, though, your cousin should have backup options. Just in case. If you're forced to break your betrothal when you come of age, it won't take long before someone else tries to take advantage. So that was it. Or at least, that was what Rosia had decided to tell her. Rigel huffed out a frustrated grunt. I get what you're trying to do. It's not your responsibility, though. Why is it so hard for you to accept a little help? Rosia snapped. Rigel, you can't spin the world by yourself. You can't be everywhere and fix every outcome. If I want to do this for you, and for her, why can't you just let me? The irritation faded and a hint of uncertainty crept into his voice as he added, do you think me such a bad option? You think I can't protect her? Rigel scowled lightly. She wasn't going to let him twist this around on her. I don't see why you'd want to, Alden. You've met her, what, once? She shook her head. I'd understand if a stranger tried this. Lots of people might assume they could influence the House of Black through Harry, or get in my good graces by protecting her. You know me, though, and you know her, albeit a little. You know she isn't really as influential as her friendship with me makes it seem. She's not in such immediate danger that someone needs to sacrifice themselves to save her, and she's not so useful to you to make her worth that gesture absent a pressing need. So why? Rosia's stare was back, only this time it was reproachful. Careful, Rigel, or you'll start believing your own publicity. She frowned. What is that supposed to mean? Have you forgotten your cousin has accomplishments in her own right? I haven't, she protested. Most wouldn't see an academic career as an asset in a woman, though. Rosia sighed. I didn't mean for this to be so confusing for you, he said, softly sardonic. Is it so hard to credit that I've a genuine interest in her? Saying yes would be churlish, but what did it say that he only mentioned the hypothetical possibility that he'd be interested in Harry herself after exhausting other routes of convincing her? Of all the half-bloods I've met, she's the most interesting, he said after a moment. Something uncomfortable rippled in his golden gaze, and Rigel supposed it might have cost him to admit to a personal curiosity toward Harry. While she doubted he'd met many half-bloods, she could admit wryly that interesting was about the most complimentary thing he ever said about another person. This is so messed up, she thought. Unbidden, a memory of what he'd said to her before the tournament started floated up from the depths of her mind. The things we do because we want to will always outweigh those we do because we have to. All of a sudden, she was tired. What did she say, then? When you asked her about it? Rosia's eyes widened, and a cautious hope she didn't want to see surfaced in them. She babbled something vague and non-committal and ran away, actually. Sometimes, the two of you are really alike, you know. Rigel grimaced at that, but didn't contradict him. Rosia cleared his throat and said, "So, do I have your permission to court her?" "You need her permission, not mine," she said begrudgingly. "Could have fooled me." She wrinkled her nose. "Well, originally I thought you were doing something weird." He gave her an offended look, but she brushed past it to add, "Ask her as many times as you want. Just don't expect her to go along with it. She only reluctantly agreed to our betrothal in the first place. Once she's of age, even if we break the betrothal, I wouldn't expect her to accept another one. Harry has no intention of marrying anyone, law or no." "Well, that's not entirely true," he corrected her. "She seemed very interested in marrying Miss Granger. Only the new law wouldn't let her, would it?" Rigel flushed involuntarily. Archie really had made a spectacle of his emotions. Being in America had dissolved what little subtlety her cousin may once have possessed. "She'll grow about that, I think," Rigel muttered. "Either way, she'll have options," Rosia said firmly. "That's all I wanted." Somehow, despite all the explanations and assertions that had just passed between them, Rigel still wasn't sure she believed him. -0. HP. -0. As Millicent sat down at the lunch table, the surrounding Slytherins automatically slid down to make room for her persistent companion. "Good day to everyone," Tariel said cheerfully to the General Assembly. The colorfully clad boy had a new accessory, a black and gold striped tie that he wore proudly, much to Millicent's chagrin. "Hello," Tariel Pansy said with a genuine smile. She liked the Magiotine Muggleborn, and Rigel suspected part of it was his undimmable happiness. "How is your family settling in?" Tariel had received special dispensation from the headmaster to remain at Hogwarts for the rest of the year. While Dumbledore could not offer him a true scholarship or actual credits, due to his being Muggleborn, he had managed to secure the boy's place there for a few months longer with the argument that the Board of Governors had already approved the attendance of each of the competitors for up to a full year. After all, when the tournament began it was unknown which of the 9 would be continuing for a second term. None of the other runners-up had elected to remain, but Owen's girlfriend, who was evidently heiress to a prominent American pureblood family, had arranged to stay on as an exchange student for a term to support him. Tariel had embraced the opportunity with gusto. As the boy pointed out, it wasn't as though he had a school to go back to. He hadn't been officially sorted, but sometime in the first week of the new term the House of Badgers had unanimously adopted him. Despite his enthusiastic participation in Hufflepuff class sections, however, it was Millicent he chose to spend most meals with. "Very well, thank you," Tariel said with a contented grin. "The most generous headmaster has gifted my mother and brother with stones just like mine," he revealed, moving the hand that was not piling food on his plate to touch the orange necklace with its embedded translation charm. "They like this funny-named village very much. Each day I bring them something different to eat from the castle. My brother is most anxious to know what I learn of wand-focused magics. I think I will try to make him one." "Make a wand? That's difficult work, especially if you want it to work right," Theo said. "Just buy one. The gold I was given for entering the tournament has brought much ease to my family, but I do not think the expense of a wand would be justified, as he can also get along without one," Tariel said. He shrugged. "Still, it would bring him joy to have even a poorly made one." "Is your brother as good at wandless magic as you are?" Draco asked. "Of course," Tariel says proudly. "He showed his ability much sooner than I did. The elders began teaching him at only 3. The Slytherins in earshot, most of whom had been afforded a good amount of pre-Hogwarts magical education, were nevertheless suitably impressed by the idea of beginning training so young. "Is he an animagus, too?" Tariel shook his head ruefully. "My brother has found his inner animal, but he has not yet connected with it." "What do you mean?" Rigel asked. She was no closer to achieving the proper transformation than she had been over the break. Perhaps Tariel had some insight from his training that could help. Tariel considered the question carefully as he chewed through a spiced potato. It is not enough to know which animal is within your soul. Many people can reach that realization. You cannot become the animal until you are the animal. Seeing the blank looks around him, he struggled to articulate his point. For some, it can be hard to admit that the animal is not merely a part of you, it is you. The good and the bad. Unless you can accept the core impulses of that animal as your own, you will never achieve the transformation. It is not lack of magical ability that prevents you, it is lack of self-knowledge or unwillingness to accept the uncomfortable truths that the animal reveals about your soul. Rigel considered that quietly as she finished her meal. What were the core impulses of a raven? Curiosity. Cleverness. She had no trouble identifying with that. She must be missing something deeper. After the meal, she made her way to the library. In the now familiar stacks containing books on rituals, she found World Symbology Anthology and hefted it over to a table to flip through. The Raven entry wasn't the longest, but neither was it brief. Certain phrases jumped out at her. A bird of clear thought and memory, evoking insight and prophecy, mischievous and curious, the raven is both messenger and troublemaker, a raven is selfish, opportunistic, cunning, and hungry, it takes what it can from the world, commonly associated with lost souls. The blackbird can signal transmutation and rebirth, secret keepers, thieves, protectors, providers. She shut the book with an annoyed sigh. How was any of that supposed to be helpful? She suspected an animal could be assigned any meaning a person wanted to see in it. None of the human-created associations would tell her what impulses the animal itself might identify with, however. Perhaps she'd have better luck with her animal biology texts. The descriptions afforded to ravens in the biological sense were easier to reconcile, she found. Predator and scavenger as needed, adaptable to different environments, fast learning, acrobatic flyers, cooperative, social, and familial. She was particularly keen to discover that unlike other, more competitive species, older raven siblings helped defend the nest to protect the chicks while the parents were away. That was a sentiment she could identify with easily. None of the information she compiled on ravens seemed to be easing the transformation, however. Try as she might, no amount of magic circulating through her veins was enough to trigger the transfiguration. The book Sirius had directed them to made it very clear that manually transforming oneself a piece at a time into the animal would not work, likely, it would kill a person instead. She could not force it. Rather, she was supposed to meditate until she reached a stage of enlightenment in which the animal emerged naturally from the soul. It frustrated Rigel no end. All her understanding of transfiguration was secondary, what mattered was achieving some sort of willy mutual understanding between her conscious mind and the animal beneath it. How she was supposed to do that with no way to communicate with the animal in the meantime, Rigel didn't know. -0. HP. -0. In the quiet hours stolen in her private laboratory, Rigel divided her time between slowly perfecting the medical potions for her shaped-imbued first aid kit and testing the theory she'd come up with while talking with Dom on the train. If a piece of magic retained the ability to resonate with the core, then it could be reabsorbed by it. That was what Dom asserted, and she grudgingly admitted he'd probably been around long enough to know. Never before had she spent so much time contemplating the nature of magic. There was wild magic, the natural magic that existed, unbound, in all things. When it collected in certain stones, animals, plants, and people, wild magic took on properties that were determined in turn by the characteristics of the thing it was shaped by. Magical beings were the only species known to have conscious control over the magic within them. Rigel had to recognize, however, that even wizards did not fully appreciate which aspects of their magic they could and could not affect. Rigel could shape her raw magic into spells, molding it into manifesting in a myriad of different ways. She could not, however, change the way her raw magic itself was shaped by its very inhabitants within her. She had learned in her first year that every witch or wizard had unique aspects to their magic. Cores formed differently, unconsciously molded to suit the individual. Inherited magic could tend darker or lighter depending on generations of subtle efforts to shape it through genetics. Finally, every being with magic had their own individual signature, minuscule variations in output that were largely undetectable at the macro level. Like radio waves, each supported a unique frequency, only compounded by a modulation algorithm that existed somewhere deep in a person's soul. Something about that unique signature became warped when a wizard consciously shaped their magic into a spell. To a casual observer, every levitation charm looked and felt the same, no matter who originally cast it. Even the Weasley twins, both adept at reading and mimicking auras, probably couldn't read the fingerprint of a spell once it had already been cast. She'd heard that auras could track the traces of a wizard's signature with enough time and sample size, but casting evidently changed the signature enough that it was an extremely difficult art. It was easier to track a wizard's wand instead, which kept echoes of spells cast for quite some time afterwards. Once it was shaped, it wouldn't resonate with the original core any longer. Rigel had to wonder whether, if a person could emit raw, unshaped magic and trap it into something neutral, that same person would be able to reabsorb the magic at leisure. As long as it was never shaped, the signature should remain constant. After all, wasn't that how blood magic worked? The magic within a person's blood was utterly raw, unshaped. When you put blood into something, weren't you really just imbuing it with your unshaped magical signature? The blood itself was symbolic but superfluous. In fact, she thought with a touch of irony, if one looked at it that way, there was no such thing as a pure or half-blood, only pure or wild magic diluted magical signatures. The great blood debate came down to nothing more significant than the swirls on everyone's fingertips. Perhaps she would write a satirical short story, a terrible account of the war between clockwise swirlers and anti-clockwise swirlers. Those poor souls whose fingerprints swirled neutrally from the middle of their fingers would be tragically caught in the middle. Friends would betray friends, families would be torn asunder. She winced as her thoughts took a dark turn. On second thought, it was too soon. Maybe a couple centuries from now, when the purebloods died out of their own inbreeding and blood purity was looked upon with the same awkward discomfort as other forms of bigotry. It's sad that polite embarrassment feels like it would be a win, she thought with a depressed sigh. Dom sent her the echo of a good feeling, and the unexpected flicker of cheer jolted her out of the morose cloud she'd drawn around herself. Now is no time to be despairing for the state of the world, she chided herself. While she had him, Rigel asked Dom something that had been bothering her lately. Why weren't you integrated with my magic when I absorbed you? It would destroy me. The answer came swift and sure. If I allowed myself to be changed by you the way raw magic is changed when you absorb it ambiently, I would no longer be me. I would be you. A pause came before Dom added. Is that what you hoped? That one day I would simply dissolve into the fire of your core? She shook her head physically, then added, because he wasn't in her lab to see, no, I just wondered. Is the reason you are able to resist it because you are powerful? It is because I have excellent control, he corrected her. Just as your enemy must, to keep his own magic from melding fully with yours even so removed from his physical influence over it. Rigel mulled that over carefully. That Riddle had superior control of his magic was unquestionably true. Was that enough to explain why he had not lost all awareness of the magic after injecting her with it? You said that Riddle must be very powerful, too, to sense his magic in me at a distance. Could I do that, if I put magic into something and someone else carried it? With enough power and control, you could do anything. She didn't like the way he said anything but was pleased that her experiment was theoretically possible, at least. Rigel had a meter mini in her palm. The imbuing toy glowed faintly when she poured raw magic into it, the same unshaped way she would put magic into the crystal meter that measured rate of magical expenditure. Now that she knew what resonance felt like, she could appreciate the slight buzzing to her magical senses for what it was. So she could, if she concentrated hard enough, recognize her own unshaped magic in other things. The next step was harder. She set the meter mini down 1 foot away on the lab table and let go. The already subtle resonance immediately stopped. Rigel frowned at it, extending her magical awareness out until the training toy was within its sphere. It felt like a little ball of magic, but she wasn't certain she could identify it as hers. Rigel would need someone else's help to complete the experiment, then. Determined, she closed the lab and wandered upstairs in search of some hapless soul. She found 2 in the entrance hall, or rather, they found her. All set to go on phase 1, pup. Fred fell into step on her left, his brother only a beat behind. We're calling it, the mysterious box, George added as he took up position on her right. Figured a weekend lunch is the perfect time to introduce it, Fred went on as they walked through the great hall doors. It's casual. Innocuous. Downright subtle. Rigel turned her head toward a crowd of curious students, all clustered around a red-paneled box underneath one of the nearest windows. Through the throng, she could make out cheerful silver tassels hanging from the box's edges, flanking it were a pair of tall golden candles, flames soft and calm. An arched emerald banner was strung between the two candles, and above the heads of those pressed close Rigel read the silver letters with amusement. Sacrifice food here. Subtle, you said. Rigel shook her head with a smile. George inclined his head gravely. It doesn't even explode. Or fizzle. Or whir. Or ooze. Or. Yes, it's the picture of restraint, she conceded. In a lower voice she added, did the headmaster agree? He seemed positively keen, Fred revealed. George nodded, looking a bit bewildered. Said if we pulled the whole thing off, he might give us a special service award. Course we told him if he did that, the whole thing would be ruined, Fred said sagely. Good pranksters don't take credit. George elbowed Rigel in the side and grinned. Suppose that makes you our patsy, then. Not yet, she said sternly. We agreed to ease into it. The twins waved her words aside. We know, said Fred. This one's for the long game, George concurred. They dropped her at the table, and Pansy leaned in as Rigel considered the food choices. Know anything about that charming new altar, Rye? So far, any food placed inside of it disappears when you close the lid. She met the blonde girl's eyes and smiled secretively, but only said, I need help with an experiment. Have you covered conscious imbuing yet in potions? Pansy blinked at her. Rigel took that as a no, anyone else able to push magic into an object consciously. What kind of spell are you casting? Theo asked, only sounding vaguely curious. It's not a spell, she said. I need someone to put raw magic into this. She pulled out one of the red rubber balls. Meet the minis again, Rigel. Millicent said from across the table. I haven't seen you with those since first year. Let me try, Blaze offered, holding out a hand. She passed the ball over and Blaze curled his fingers around it gently. After a long pause, it bled from red to brown and finally to green. There. Just like imbuing a runic array. Rigel grinned. Thanks. She took out the one she had imbued earlier and gave it to him as well. Now mix them up behind your back and don't tell me which is which. With an intrigued glint to his eyes, Blaze did as she asked. When he offered them to her again, one in each hand, he asked, are you going to try to differentiate them? Exactly, she murmured, drawing in her focus to press her magical senses outward. She could feel both balls, warm little orbs of magic side by side. Draw them apart a bit, she said, frowning. As Blaze drew his hands apart, she tried to compare the two spheres. The magic in them wasn't static, magic never was. It churned through each of the small toys in restless circles, but there was definitely a difference. One spun with a purpose, while the other sort of drifted. She thought one of them felt warmer, in a way, but did that necessarily mean it was hers? Rigel hesitated, then reached out to point at the one that felt warmer and more energetic. Is this one mine? Blaze smiled. Correct. He seemed impressed, but Rigel wasn't satisfied. Your magic is pretty different from mine. Maybe I should test it against another fire core. She flipped through her memories of the sleeping sickness and said, Millie, your core is fire, right? Millicent shrugged. Suppose so, but I don't know how to transfer magic like that. It's easy, Rigel began. At the same time, Blaze said, it's tricky. They glanced at one another, and at Blaze's raised eyebrows, Rigel relented. Well, perhaps you should teach her, Blaze. Her dark-eyed friend smiled wryly. Give us a few weeks, and you can attempt the next stage in your experiment. Rigel wanted to sigh at having to wait so long when she was impatient to know the answer now. She refrained, as it would likely come across as ungrateful. Thanks, she said. I appreciate the help. What will you do once you know whether you can recognize the magic you split off? Millicent asked. If it's something to do with that mysterious red box, count me out. I'm not going to the trouble of learning a difficult skill just for one of your pranks. My pranks? Rigel put a hand to her heart. You really think I have time for pranks with all that's going on this year? You have time to experiment with esoteric magic, Theo pointed out with a teasing grin. Rigel had no response to that, and her friends shared a laugh at her expense. Is it your mysterious box, Rigel? Draco asked quietly from beside her as the conversation around them moved on. Or are those GRYFFs roping you into something again? She grinned a little and said, that would be telling. Sorlaser, help us, it is your box, Draco muttered on a sigh. It's really everyone's box, in a way, Rigel said lightly. Draco narrowed his eyes in flat suspicion. What does that mean? She promised he would find out with everyone else, and ignored his argument that being friends ought to gain him insider information about such things. The mysterious box was one prank she didn't want to mess up, even if it meant keeping her friends in the dark, too. The Weasley twins had been very selective about whom exactly they'd enlisted to help them pull it off, and the least Rigel could do after all the trouble they'd gone to was keep the details need to know. -0. HP. -0. As January waned, the boxes multiplied. The signage varied, as did the method of appearance. Some, like the one with a mouth drawn in the lid saying "Simply Feed Me," appeared overnight. Others, such as the one proclaiming "Donate here to make wishes come true," hopped itself into the Great Hall one morning in a manner that very much suggested the animator twins were in on the game. When, the first week of February, a box with the banner reading "The God of Anonymous Valentine's Demands Tribute" appeared, the accusations came flooding in. It seemed a good number of people still remembered that prank. Rigel enjoyed playing the reticent trickster, allowing her eyes to twinkle in her best Dumbledorian impression whenever someone worked up the courage to ask whether she was, in fact, behind the strange and elaborate boxes. After several weeks, most people seemed to have simply accepted the boxes as part of the Hogwarts aesthetic, that the professors, at the headmaster's behest, did nothing about them added an extra element of the surreal. Curious students regularly tested the boxes, but each time the result was constant: food, and anything else, put inside it disappeared. A particularly irritated Anthony Goldstein climbed into a box midway through the 4th week, but he was not whisked into non-being, to the general disappointment of those watching. Her most fervent accuser, somewhat surprisingly, was Ju. The Ravenclaw stopped by the Slytherin table several times a week to say, "I just know you're the one behind this, Rigel. Won't you tell me what you've planned?" Rigel gathered the other claws had elected Ju, as Rigel's only close Ravenclaw friend, to inquire into the mystery as often as feasible. The lot of them couldn't stand being left in the dark. She gave increasingly enigmatic responses. When Ju dropped by the table again the morning before Valentine's Day, Rigel gave a vague smile and murmured, "Ah, yes, the offerings are most generous of late. Many blessings abound." As Ju smiled wryly and sauntered back to her impatiently awaiting housemates, Pansy gave a small sigh from beside her and said, "Really, Rigel, you're going to have to let her down more firmly at this rate." Rigel shook her head patiently. "I told you, she and her housemates are just curious. As soon as the boxes are understood, this interest will die down." "Give it up," Pansy Theo said on a laugh. "Blokes like Rigel will always attract the hopeless romantic types." Before Rigel could decide whether she ought to be offended, the post arrived. Hands made way automatically for claws and beaks, and conversation paused as the owls made their presence insistently known. They'd scarcely recovered their utensils when Millicent hissed under her breath, "Here she comes again." Ju appeared at Rigel's elbow slightly out of breath and slapped a periodical on the table beside her plate. "Is this Ray Owl?" Rigel blinked at the magazine before gingerly lifting it to either front cover. It was the Quibbler, and the headline shouted up at them, "Mysterious food donations appear nationwide. First signs of a house elf revolution." A snort escaped her before she could stop it. Despite the absence of any mention of them, it had Fred and George written all over it. "Where did you get this?" she asked, amused. "Lovergood, of course," Ju said impatiently. "You can't believe anything you see in that rag," Draco said with a frown. Ju tossed her hair impatiently. "Yes, normally, but look at the article. Draco and Millicent both grabbed for it at once, and wound up holding it awkwardly between themselves as they both scanned the content swiftly. The date of the first reported incident matches when the first box appeared, Millicent muttered as she read. Of course, with Lovergood here to report on it, that doesn't mean anything necessarily. Draco made a noise of agreement, but added, it says these unsolicited food donations have appeared everywhere from St. Mungo's to the Diagon Alley Food Kitchen to Dumbledore's new halfway home for squibs. With places this high profile, the truth would be easy to verify. We've got everyone who knows someone at any of the locations cited already writing letters for more information, Ju said briskly. Her eyes were bright with excitement as she grinned down at Rigel, who was struggling to keep a blank expression on her face. Smart thinking, Rigel said blandly. Might be unnecessary, though. Not drew everyone's attention to the other side of the Great Hall, where a towering red and white confection that might have been a cake hidden under a pile of taffeta hearts was progressing steadily across the room. Fred, George, and the animator twins carried it together between them, and the lack of struggle with the enormous pastry suggested magical assistance at work. The hall held a collective breath as the four boys lowered the cake carefully toward the newest box. The lip of the box stretched gluttonously until the entire 6-foot concoction slid unobstructed into its gullet. The lid snapped shut after it, and the Great Hall exploded with the speculation of 1,000 students. That's going to be hard to miss, Ju murmured. I rather think that's the point, Blaze said dryly. As usual, the dark-skinned boy was entirely correct. The next morning, students at every table awaited the post with an almost palpable anticipation, built up over weeks of unsatisfied curiosity and confusion. Rigel even saw Professor McGonagall tapping her plate impatiently, eyes trained on the open doors. All around her, Rigel saw Valentine's Day packages ignored in favor of the nearest Daily Prophet. The collective occupants of St. Mungo's Children's Ward smiled out of the front page, a piece of distinctive taffeta-topped cake in every hand. Rigel leaned closer to Pansy's copy to pick out the words beneath. Valentine's surprise at St. Mungo's. Yesterday St. Mungo's was the recipient of a 6-tier, £100 holiday surprise. A cake large enough to serve the entire hospital appeared without warning or explanation in the kitchens just after breakfast. This wasn't the first such surprise donation, however. For weeks, St. Mungo's, along with a number of other charitable institutions throughout the wizarding world, has had a rush of anonymous food donations. Without fail, these donations appear seemingly of their own accord in kitchens and donation bins, never accompanied by so much as a word of explanation. According to eyewitnesses, no apparent portkey apparatus has been noted, and of course our readers understand that it is impossible to apparate an item song wizard to transport it. How are these donations finding their way to these institutions, then? It is, as of now, a mystery. The ministry was contacted as the first of these food offerings began to pour in, and officials reportedly conducted extensive testing to ensure the mysterious donations were safe to distribute and not a malicious prank. James Potter, current department head, assures us, no evidence of malintent or foul play was uncovered. We've determined these anonymous donations are just that, contributions to the less fortunate meant in charitable spirit. When asked to comment on the strange phenomenon, the director for outreach at St. Mungo's had this to say: "Thank you. Whoever you are, however you're doing this, we're grateful. You have our assurance that as long as the donations last, they won't go to waste." Rigel leaned back with a smile on her face. If she'd ever questioned the Weasley twins' talent for public relations, the proof was in black and white. They were geniuses. How did you do it? She turned to see Ju, this time accompanied by at least a dozen of her housemates, standing with an awed expression on her face. Rigel tilted her head. Still so sure it was me. She didn't deny it, and by the looks of sharp suspicion in the claw's eyes, that didn't pass unnoticed. The Weasley twins are obviously in on it, Anthony Goldstein opined. Those Slytherin twins, too. But this is bigger than some prank. It's a publicity stunt or something, right? What are you trying to get out of it? How did you even do this? The questions came too fast to pick out all of them, but she got the general gist. With a shrug, Rigel asked a question of her own. Do you know what happens to the food we don't eat every day? The group around their table fell silent. From behind her, she heard Pansy say, some of it is fed to the creatures in the forest. Some gets composted, too, an older Ravenclaw said slowly, his face scrunched in thought. I had to turn it into soil in detention for Sprout once. And the rest? Vanished, Draco muttered. Rigel put a hand to her ear. What's that, Draco? Her friend scowled at her, but raised his voice. The elves vanish it after every meal. I've seen them do it. Rigel knew he had, she'd been there, too. Raised eyebrows and understanding murmurs circulated for a moment before Ju said slowly, so you set up a way for excess food to be transported to other places that can use it. But how, Rigel? Is it like a vanishing cabinet? Or a one-way flue? Rigel blinked at the girl, a devilish mischief alight in her heart. Who said I set up anything? The Ravenclaws groaned, and the Slytherins snickered into their plates. Honestly, do they expect him to admit it? Theo chuckled. The group dispersed with grumbled words of disappointment, and Rigel went back to her now chilly porridge. Her friends were all eyeing her, so she raised an eyebrow at them. What? You, too? You don't have to tell us. Millicent sniffed. I'm just wondering how you got the staff to go along with this for so long. It's not much of an extra expense, Rigel said quietly. Most of the food put into the boxes really would have been vanished anyway. The cake was just to make a point. The house elves are the ones moving the food, though, aren't they? Pansy murmured. They don't need vanishing cabinets to do something so simple. Rigel grinned. House elves really were amazing beings. Fred and George had sent her as the emissary to convince them to alter the way they dealt with leftover food. With the headmaster's approval, the kitchen workers had been thrilled to take a few extra steps after each meal. The elaborate boxes were just for show, house elves did the real work, transporting anything put in them to similar boxes below in the kitchens, the same way food was transported back and forth between the house tables and the 4 parallel tables downstairs. The elves would sort out unsuitable items left in the boxes, half-eaten or contaminated food, and the rest was sent to where it could do more good than vanishing into non-being. Eventually, the idea was to have one permanent donation bin by the Great Hall doors, where anything that a student no longer wanted could be given to someone in need. With this as an alternative, the elves could stop relegating lost items to the come-and-go room entirely. Dumbledore, according to the twins, thought the prank would instill a charitable awareness in the student population without seeming condescending or overly superior, as it might if introduced by the staff. Fred and George, of course, were simply hoping to turn Rigel's public image on its head after the somewhat gritty aura she'd gained. As she considered the way her schoolmates were responding to the prank, as curious and incredulous as the twins had envisioned, Rigel thought they might just succeed in all 3 goals at once. -0. HP. -0. As though Riddle feared any ebb in public fervor, the announcement informing the champions of the 4th task was dovetailed with a press conference. On the castle lawn, another of the DMG's many temporary stages was erected. All 3 of the finalists were obliged to answer questions from those of the press corps invited for the event, and while Rigel was far from keen to face off against the grating Miss Skeeter once more, she had to admit the woman was dangerously good at her job. With a tenacious smile that was almost eclipsed by the blonde curls that clung to her head, Rita Skeeter neatly cross-foiled Delacour's remark that the tournament was a proving ground of traditional magical abilities, with Owen's assertion that creativity and problem-solving were at the heart of every task. Somehow, and Rigel herself wasn't quite sure whether Skeeter had engineered the statement or not, the reporter got Owens to say, "The real competition hasn't started yet." She was sure they'd be seeing that tagline splayed below the photograph of the 3 blood champions in their smartest robes, Hogwarts beautiful and snow-capped behind them. She wondered whether Riddle had engineered this backdrop with a particular intention. He stood tall in sweeping, silver-trimmed robes of deepest black. Against the snow, he cut a dramatic figure, all the more so for how at home he appeared with the seat of his opposition rising triumphantly behind him. Rigel sensed Skeeter's eyes when they landed on her, like carrion beetles alighting on a meal. She had time to turn her attention back to the small crowd of reporters before the woman raised a single, acid-green-clad hand and the clamor around her snuffed itself in anticipation. "This one is for the young Mr. Black," Skeeter purred. All Rigel could think was that Binny sometimes called her the very same thing. "Yes, Miss Skeeter. All of Wizarding Britain has been at Twitter over a wave of mysterious food donations this month. That sounds more like a statement, Rigel said, a genuine smile finding its way into her voice. If Skeeter was leading where she thought, then Fred and George had truly come into their own. Amusement and anticipation threaded through the assembled members of the press as Skeeter's leading statement found purchase in their imaginations. The savvy woman smiled with approval, even as she let out a tittering laugh for strategic effect. I heard a rumor, Mr. Black. Some of the students at this very school believe they have evidence that paints you as the mysterious architect behind this widespread charitable phenomenon. My question, she drew out the word like a boa constrictor might indulgently squeeze its catch, is this: if you are the one behind it, what made you take time away from preparation for this dangerous and prestigious tournament to pull such a stunt? Rigel let a coy smile curl about her lips and cast her eyes to the side as though she were thinking about her response. When she looked back at Skeeter's sharp gaze, Rigel caught respect there for a brief moment. I can neither confirm nor deny the rumors of my involvement. On an unrelated note, I'd like to say that the Cora Foundation is a non-profit initiative backed by the Black and Malfoy families to get life-saving potions to children in need. She paused to allow the reporters to scribble down the name, then added. Minister Fudge was instrumental in its creation. Isn't that right, Minister? Put on the spot, Fudge preened and launched into a long-winded account of his personal interest in the good of the wizarding community. Rigel stepped back and smiled at the way Riddle's press conference dissolved into curiosity about this new cross-party charity. Eventually, Riddle had no choice but to step in to bring focus back to the tournament. I'm sure you're all wondering just what the fourth task will entail, he proclaimed with a clap of his hands. Attention snapped back to him like a stretched bowstring abruptly released. Much like the first task of the preliminaries, the first task of the finals will take place in a unique arena. Instead of the Dark Forest, our next task will take place in the Black Lake. Rigel frowned as the questions burst one by one from the impatient reporters. Did you say in the Black Lake? How long? But what precise task will there? Lord Riddle, will the observation orbs be used again? At Skeeter's question, Riddle inclined his head. Indeed, and 3 of the runic mirrors will be recalled to Hogwarts for the viewing pleasure of all who secure tickets to this fantastic task. Can you picture it? Our champions will brave the cold, oxygen-less depths of the mysterious Black Lake, swim through its murky waters, evade the countless creatures of the deep, all to find, well, that would be telling. Millicent and Pansy were right, then, the task was some sort of treasure hunt. There were plenty of valuable things in the lake. A dozen rare ingredients came easily to mind. Rigel had never harvested anything underwater, and the thought that the fourth task might be like a subsurface scavenger hunt was cheering. Much better than duels, at least. After a flurry of questions, Riddle stepped back to allow Misters Crouch and Bagman to expound on how the tournament was fostering international relations. Heavily emphasized in their speech was the assertion that the assessed value of increased trade had already outstripped the losses from restitutions paid following the unfortunate World Cup incident. Whether by accident or design, Riddle's retreat brought him to stand beside Rigel, his proximity like a concentrated aura of ill omens. She was unlikely to get an easier chance to speak to him without approaching him directly, but Rigel wondered whether he would be able to control his reaction to the question she wanted to ask. She supposed, either way, his reaction or lack thereof would tell her something. I heard a rumor, too, she hissed near silently. Her mouth barely moved to accommodate the sibilant language. About your self-painted altruism. Riddle sounded bored, but he answered her in Parseltongue, nonetheless, careful to keep it below the register of human hearing. About a mutual enemy, Razorfixing in London. Rigel cut her eyes to watch Riddle's expression as she added, at least, I assumed the rope construct was your enemy. Perhaps I was mistaken. Riddle's attention swung toward her with an almost audible snap. His brilliant eyes drilled into her, shock warring with anger and disbelief. His first words were a denial. You lie. To what end? To distract me from the present climate. This is directly related to the present climate, or can't you see that much? Rigel rolled her shoulders and pretended to look about the crowd, pleasant smile fixed in place for the sake of the press. When she chanced another glance at him, Riddle's face was sharply closed, and his eyes had gone still in thought. The extremists, he whispered, almost too quiet for Rigel to hear. The attacks, you believe it is all the work of that failed experiment. If you are not behind it yourself, she said, a shrug in her voice despite her still and relaxed posture. I did entertain the thought that you may be working together. Riddle's answering hiss was onomatopoeic in its wordless outrage. Collaborate with that mad, broken thing? Never. It makes sense, though, Rigel argued. She was more than half convinced of his sincere indignation, if nothing else, but she drew the accusation out to be sure. What a coincidence that the attack this summer happened to make those in power desperate for more revenue, and along comes your competition. My tournament was approved long before the attacks began. Riddle spat the words through his teeth, even as he smiled dashingly for the flashing cameras. I strongly suggest you refrain from further accusations, lest I forget that we have a mutual enemy at all. His threat was hollow, if his anger and shock were real. Rigel raised a hand to acknowledge the gesturing photographers, even as she hissed, then as the enemy of your enemy, I'll tell you to watch your back, it is poaching your people to fliss out its shranks. It dares. Riddle's reaction was so vehement, Delacour, who was closest to where they stood, rubbed her ear as some of the unintelligible sounds in the human range reached her. The politician reined in his fury, belly, and demanded, who? Barty Crouch, she said blandly. Apparently you have not kept him busy enough this year. Riddle's anger vanished in an instant, like lightning into a rod, as though the promise of an eventual outlet was enough to ground it for the time being. It was mildly terrifying to witness, and Rigel felt a strange gratitude that it was not she who would ultimately face the tempered wrath. How soon he forgets what favors he owes me, Riddle mused, soft as a sigh but much more sinister. Rigel couldn't resist. Technically, he is still serving you. That miscreation is not me. My followers should know better. It was not that mad thing that raised them to the exalted position they hold today. Riddle's words came fast, hissed together in a string that would have been difficult for even an actual snake to follow. He seemed to have forgotten that Rigel was there as his ire flowed hot once more, except, of course, that Riddle never lost touch with his surroundings. Except when he did, she amended after remembering the rage he'd flown into at the Malfoy summer garden party after second year. Who beat the cobwebs off a disparate, entombed platform and forged it into a monument that could withstand the modern stomach? Who drummed a political movement from tatty tradition and disenfranchised elites? Who fashioned legislation and lasting change from naught but old complaints and stubbornists? How quickly they forget, these rats of the present age. Riddle was really on a roll, and Rigel hated to interrupt him, but the tournament organizers were looking their way, clearly waiting for him to dismiss the press conference. Crouches, she began, but Riddle's quiet vehemence latched onto the name before she could finish. Crouch. The turncoat. Does he think the construct can better serve his ambitions? Who dealt with his father when? His father is waiting for you to dismiss everyone, she hissed through a mouth of teeth clenched so hard she felt them creak. Riddle moved his eyes from the distant line of trees he'd been silently scorching with his gaze to the group of people waiting politely, if a bit unsurely, for his go-ahead. The man's shoulders twitched subtly, as though shaking off an uninvited hand, and he favored each of the assembled with a smile that was both personal and promising. I'm afraid that's all the time we have today. Please direct any further inquiries to the DMGS staff. I'll see you all in 3 days' time for the fourth task. The gathered began to scatter, in twos and threes as cameramen packed up their accoutrements and made for the school gates. Delacour left at once, but Owens lingered. When Rigel met his gaze, she found an unexpected heat there. His usually relaxed face was taut, a deep-seated flame flashing in the shadows of his eyes, like a knife glinting in dark. His gaze slid from her to Riddle, who was watching the departing press, and the fire was banked. When Owens looked back at her again, a crooked smile crawled across his cheek and he winked. Rigel blinked, and the expression was gone. All-around American boy Jacob Owens was back, strolling his way off the stage without a care in the world. She frowned after him, but Riddle regained her attention with a quiet word. Rigel. She turned to find the man imperiously close to her, head slightly tilted in a way that was certainly meant to be intimidating. Riddle, she said flatly, unperturbed. I trust you will not share this rumor with anyone until I have dealt with it. Rigel scowled at his presumption. I will deal with it as I see fit, as will you. She already had, besides. Do not toy with me on this, boy, Riddle hissed. He leaned further into her personal space, and Rigel bristled. Her magic flared out in a wave, much as it had with Siloam at the first Yule Gala she'd attended. Unlike Lestrange, Riddle wasn't moved. The magic washed over him like a wave breaking on a rock. Amusement turned his lips. It'll take more than that, I'm afraid. His posture relaxed as he slipped back into English, and the man turned to go. That sounds like a challenge, Dom whispered in her ear. She narrowed her eyes and sent another pulse, this time at the stage beneath his feet. The wood wrinkled, Riddle stumbled, and the few remaining reporters tittered unkindly. He spun back around and a whip of magic raced through the air between them, faster than her senses could track. She only knew it was there by the sting that bloomed in her cheek on its heel. Rigel stood unflinching, rooted to the spot at the realization that Riddle's magic had moved quicker than hers could react. Riddle could fling his magic faster than an explosion, which her magic was more than capable of intercepting. Rigel kept her gaze steady until Riddle, apparently satisfied, recovered his dignity and quit the stage. I regret nothing, she thought, consciously unrepentant in spite of the welt she could feel forming on her cheek. Her own little construct chuckled lowly. A tar goal. -0. HP. -0. Her good feeling about the fourth task lasted until she miracled Archie to explain it. It's probably some sort of scavenger hunt, she said, smiling. Should be pretty low threat, aside from the creatures that live in the lake. Archie stared at her from the glass, eyes wide. Rigel, has it occurred to you that you'll be in the lake? She nodded, unconcerned. Of course. Don't worry, Archie. I actually have the perfect potion for this task, but it seems a shame to waste something so rare. Gillyweed will do just as well, I think. Professor Snape said the task isn't planned for longer than an hour. No, I mean, you'll have to go swimming in the lake. In something you can swim in. Which will probably not be loose-fitting. Archie's voice grew increasingly high as she blinked at him. Rigel, you're going to make me look like a eunuch. She hushed him and peeked out of her silenced curtains just to be sure none of her roommates had wandered in. Don't be dramatic. No one will be looking at that. Everyone will be looking at that. Rigel frowned. Surely not. Then again, when had her faith in humanity been rewarded? You think so? I could wear several layers, and the water is going to be cold. Not that cold. Archie groaned. He ran a hand over his face, and then a disquieting grin crept across it. All right. Don't worry. I am abruptly worried. I'm going to send you something. Don't ask any questions. This is about my reputation as a man. Rigel sighed. I swear if you send me a rolled-up pair of socks. It was so much worse than socks. Rigel received a nondescript package the next morning, plain brown paper and no return address. It was so innocuous that every student at the Slytherin table eyed it with interest. She tucked the wand-sized box under her arm with a grimace and decided to open it in private. Her intuition hadn't failed her. In an out-of-the-way alcove, under the invisibility cloak, Rigel opened the box to reveal a lurid pink calling card that flashed the words Innocent Illusions, Hogsmeade's premier adult toy shop in metallic script. With a choked laugh that bubbled out of unadulterated horror, Rigel lifted the card aside to reveal a length of turgid silicone nestled in purple cloth. Self-adhering strap-on was helpfully embroidered on the silk covering. She poked it. The apparatus had a strange amount of give, and it was flesh-colored, which somehow made it worse. With a mortified groan, she closed the box again and rubbed her eyes in disbelief. Seriously, Archie, what the hell? Did he really expect her to wear it? Of course he did. After several long breaths she opened the box again and tried to look at it clinically. She dug to the bottom and read the directions. Twice. It would adhere to her with a simple spell, could be released with another. Truly, it didn't seem complicated. According to the advertisement, the artificial member would even function like a normal one, rising and falling as her own bodily fluctuations dictated. I never needed this much fidelity into the male form, she thought silently. She had almost made it over the hump from disturbed to darkly amused. The few times she'd polyjuiced as Archie had been more than enough for one lifetime. She did have to admit that polyjuice itself couldn't solve this problem. There was no time to brew the modified polyjuice, even if there hadn't been a large probability that changing the ultimate sex of the gene fusion ritual would noticeably change her appearance, too. If she looked at it objectively, Archie's plan was an elegant solution. The trouble was, she wasn't completely convinced the problem even merited a solution at all. Rigel still doubted people would be paying attention to what she carried between her legs when so much life and death action was unfolding. It would make Archie feel better if she wore it, though, and her cousin had asked precious little of her all year. Rigel wrapped the box in her cloak and tucked the whole thing into her bag before securing it firmly. 11-year-old me would have been hard-pressed to predict this, she thought, giving in to the humor completely. I hope it doesn't make it harder to swim. -0. HP. -0. Champion of charity, Black gives back. Just days before the resumption of Triwizard tournament tasks, this reporter got a chance to speak face-to-face to the three finalists. The delectable Fleur Delacour, dressed for winter weather in a sable-trimmed overrobe, expressed admiration for the varied trials presented thus far, while Jacob Owens, Ilvermorny heartthrob, admitted genuine trepidation regarding the coming tasks. The real competition is just getting started, everything before was a warm-up. There is little doubt that the road ahead will bring both danger and delight for our beloved blood champions, but for one of the finalists, there is a more pressing challenge to be faced. My readers have no doubt been following the recent accounts of spontaneous donations made to a rash of charitable institutions. While each contribution was made anonymously, this reporter has tracked them back to their source, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Multiple eyewitnesses confirmed that the extravagant Valentine's Day cake delivered to St. Mungo's last week was in fact present the day before in the Great Hall. Evidently, a series of donation boxes have been appearing in the hall, one after another, for weeks. Given this, coupled with the fact that every mysterious donation appeared without portkey, this reporter suspects the instrument of miraculous delivery to be none other than the Hogwarts house elves. But who ordered the house elves of Hogwarts to begin making these impressive charitable donations? When questioned on whether he sanctioned the bequests, Headmaster Albus Dumbledore had this to say: Hogwarts students have long been disposed to the occasional prank. Tradition dictates that, absent any pressing danger or harm, the faculty overlooks such expressions of creativity. This much, all of us blessed to attend the great school can attest, but are we to believe that students orchestrated what some are calling the greatest concentrated effort to raise public awareness of the decade? This reporter went to the students themselves and asked one question: who do you think is behind this prank? It's not a one-man effort, said one 7th year who wishes to remain anonymous. I think someone has united the pranksters of Hogwarts for a larger purpose. The Weasley twins were seen carrying the cake, another student agreed. The Animator twins, a pair of young Slytherins suspected to be associated with elaborate pranks, too. That said, this whole thing is sort of Black's calling card. Rigel Black is behind it, it's always him, a young Ravenclaw assured me. He did a Valentine's Day delivery service before. Romantic Rigel, we called him. She provided a list of past pranks associated with Air Black, compelling evidence of a trend toward the altruistic. Archerus Black, called Rigel by his close friends, has made an impressive showing in the tournament thus far, but he was making a splash at Hogwarts long before he was chosen to represent the school. Readers may recall that Black was directly involved in curing the sleeping sickness at just 11. Potions Master Severus Snape cited the boy's help in developing the latest improvement to the Wolfsbane potion at 12, and academic records acquired from the Ministry's official file system reveal that last year this dedicated student somehow acquired an astonishing number of credits across the spectrum of magical specialties. Accounts from those close to him describe Black as a compassionate soul who consistently goes out of his way to help others. With a portfolio like that, accomplishing a demonstration of the scale we have seen these past weeks is not at all beyond his capabilities. What does Black himself have to say? The modest boy takes no credit for the donations. Instead, he used the opportunity presented by this reporter's question to speak of a new charitable project called the Cora Foundation. The foundation is the brainchild of Lords Lucius Malfoy and Sirius Black, an unlikely combination of benefactors, to say the least. This reporter had to double-check the facts before printing them, but it's true, the Malfoys and Blacks have teamed up to turn what started as a single joint donation to the St. Mungo's Children's Ward into a far-reaching social endeavor aimed to ensure equal access to costly life-saving potions. It's safe to say that Black has his eye on the bigger picture. Following his tongue-in-cheek stunt, a tidal wave of donations from all over the country has come pouring into big-name charities such as the Orphan Fund. Local centers, too, have benefited, with contributions up 15% across the board. As one reader put it, when a Hogwarts student can do this, it puts the rest of us adults to shame. One thing in this mystery is clear, the new Triwizard Tournament lived up to its claims to procure the finest young wizards and witches in the world. If the tasks tested virtue alone, this reporter would bet it all on Black. Rigel could only hide behind the paper for so long. At Millicent's impatient cough, she lowered the crisp pages to the table and offered a grimace to her friends' expectant faces. "Would you believe me if I said this wasn't my doing?" "Yes," Draco said with a snort. Millie only smiled. "It doesn't matter who did it. Rigel, you're society's darling. Until tomorrow, at least," she muttered. Cynicism seemed the only possible response to anything bylined by Rita Skeeter, despite the objective victory to Archie's reputation the article represented. She would have to get the twins something truly excellent for their birthday this year. "Focus on today," then Theo suggested. "You've got a task to win, don't you?" As though she could forget. Rigel was already wearing her swim costume under her robes, which consisted of several compression shirts, an uncomfortably snug pair of shorts, and Archie's special gift, which she was emphatically not thinking about. After all the hype, the fourth task still seemed almost anticlimactic. Even underwater, what was a scavenger hunt compared to a race through the Forbidden Forest, a death-defying obstacle course, and a grueling series of one-on-one duels? She made her way down to the lake without any noticeable nerves. Pansy and Draco wanted to walk with her, but were called away by Professor Snape to answer for a discrepancy in one of their joint assignments. Rigel didn't mind. For once, she was completely prepared for whatever happened. When she reached the lakeside, it was to see only a small group of people waiting in the cold. Some practical soul had decided that, as they were going to be viewing the task through the observation orbs anyway, there was no need to drag spectators away from their usual seats. The audience would remain at the Quidditch pitch, which left the champions to prepare in relative peace at the Black Lake's rocky shore. "Mr. Black, you can leave anything you don't want to get wet in the tent." Crouch gestured to a modest pavilion, from which Delacour was just emerging in a shining silver swimsuit. Rigel ducked inside and shucked her outer robe with a shiver. A couple of firm warming charms, and she felt comfortable enough to abandon her shoes and socks as well. From her robe pocket, she unwrapped a wad of viscous gillyweed. Her Liber Aspirare potion would live to see another use. She hesitated over her pocket watch. It would be good to have an easy way to check the time, but she didn't know whether it was waterproof. There was a latch behind the watch face that she'd never figured out how to open. For all she knew, there might be something delicate inside, like a piece of paper or a lock of hair. In the end, she left it on top of her robes. She hoped the Tempest charm worked underwater. Rigel picked her way carefully to the edge of the water. Delacour gazed thoughtfully into the dark water, but Owens looked over at Rigel as she approached. "Now we can start," he said with a friendly grin. "Actually, we must wait for the appointed hour," Crouch disagreed. "Makes it easier to judge your times," Bagman added with a self-deprecating laugh. He held a trio of headbands out. "You remember these beauties? Blue for the lady. Yellow for our American contender. And green for our resident Slytherin, of course." Next, Crouch produced 3 metal bracelets. Rigel recognized them as more permanent versions of the parchments they'd each been given in the first task. The bracelets clamped down over their wrists and covered the skin between hand and elbow. Concentric circles were etched in iridescent color that would no doubt glow underwater. 3 dots blinked on each one. Rigel noted how carefully Crouch determined who would get which bracelet. Whatever the dots tracked were not all the same, then. "Today's task is collection," Bagman said bracingly. "Each champion has 3 items to collect, the general location of which is displayed on your wrist gauges. The first to return to the surface of the lake, not necessarily the shore, with all 3 of his or her respective items will gain the most points. Partial credit will be awarded for the retrieval of only some of the items. Is there a time limit? Owens asked. No. Crouch said firmly. But once you surface, you cannot return below again. Rigel exchanged a look with the other two champions. She could tell they were thinking the same thing. If there was no time limit, why would anyone come back with less than all three items? What are ZE items? Fleur asked, examining her bracelet with a frown. It does not Z. Bagman laughed loudly. You'll know them when you see them. Each is unmistakably marked. Rigel supposed they would be color coordinated, like the headbands. With the clock ticking toward the hour, Bagman and Crouch hustled the three champions into their starting positions, spaced by several dozen paces along the waterline. At the organizer's urging, Rigel put on her headband, feeling the observation magic activate as the inside band touched the skin of her forehead. She kept her gaze forward toward the rippling, mirror-black surface of the lake, even as she steadily fed herself the slimy weed that had been kept warm by her hand. She had only just swallowed when Bagman's magnified voice rang out. Begin. Rigel heard the others begin to wade into the cold water, but she paused a moment to let the change brought on by the raw ingredient shudder through her. Amazing plant, gillyweed. Cultivated for centuries by a reclusive coven of hags, its modern form was only discovered when an herbologist on a collection trip fell in love with what he believed to be a human-mermaid hybrid. The transformation was both akin to polyjuice and not, more a blooming than a twisting, followed by an intense, unqualified urge to get in the water. She surged forward, some animal instinct more in control of her than she was, and it wasn't until the water closed over her head that clear thought returned and she was able to take stock. Her body had indeed taken on the characteristics she'd read about, but knowing and experiencing were different things. Rigel took an experimental swipe at the water and marveled at the way her webbed appendages propelled her forward with ease. This was another reason she'd gone with gillyweed over other options. Rigel was not a particularly strong swimmer, and her new fins would give her an advantage. As the water passed through her gills, air came into her lungs without effort, and the brief discomfort of holding her breath was gone. She peered through the murky blue water without trouble. It took her a moment to notice that her headband was emitting a light of its own. It cut a strange path of illumination in the direction her head was pointing, unnaturally clear wherever the beam landed. She supposed the spectators needed something worth seeing down in the depths. Rigel tilted her wrist to check the closest item's bearing and took off in that direction with a whooshing displacement of water. Once she found a rhythm, she crossed the vast distance with astonishing speed. Focused on the steady pull through the water, she found it difficult to mark time passing. The terrain, too, seemed meaninglessly disordered. How much ground she covered was impossible to say without distances printed on the bracelet. The closest dot on the tracker took her into a field of long lakeweed, which snaked around her in ebbs and flows as she passed, like slimy wheat swaying in an invisible wind. She dove in and through it with a playful enjoyment that didn't seem entirely hers, allowing her webbed feet and hands to carry her forward in spiraling dives, which she sort of hoped made at least a few of those watching queasy. A grip on her ankle arrested her mid-spin, and Rigel twisted, expecting to find it tangled in the weed bed. Instead, she caught a pale green grindillo latched on, pointed teeth readying to bite. Rigel kicked her other leg around and wrapped it sharply about the head, mindful to avoid its little horns. It startled, jaws clicking together on nothing, but its strong grip didn't waver. She palmed her wand and pointed it threateningly, but the creature seemed to have no appreciation for the danger it represented. Admittedly, it probably wouldn't have encountered a wand in its own backyard before, unless a first year had dropped one over the side of a boat. She didn't really want to kill it, despite the annoyingly strangling grip it maintained on her ankle. Aside from the unnecessariness of such an action, the blood could attract anything. Ex-Headmaster Dippet had a number of suggestions for gentle extraction from an unreasonable foe, and it was with a smile that Rigel tried a spell she'd been looking forward to with a bit of morbid curiosity for some time. Rigel flipped her wand around and pointed it at herself before mouthing, "Lubricus corpus." Slime bloomed from every pore, and Rigel had to fight the urge to squeak at the sensation. It was somewhere between ticklish and uncomfortable, but it left her coated as effectively as a good basting. Her ankle slipped from the grindillo's grasp like a fish, and she shot away from it with a grin. The creature snarled at her and tried to pursue, but when she bent her appendages to the task, She easily outstripped it. If anything, the slick glaze covering her entire body helped her move even faster through the water. The blinking dot on her forearm was the only indication that she was heading in the correct direction. It drifted closer to the center as she wove around ridges and knolls, through gullies and gorges. Her path took her right to the edge of a cliff, where a field of giant spirulina ended abruptly before a drop-off. At the very precipice of the bluff something glinted, reflecting the light of her headlamp. She approached carefully, but there didn't seem to be any protections set up to stymie her. Tied to a stake that had been unceremoniously thrust into the lake was a golden circlet no bigger than a grapefruit. She eyed the emerald green sash that secured the ring and supposed this was what they meant when they said the items would be unmistakably marked for each champion. Rigel circled the golden prize carefully, searching for a ward or trap. It seemed too easy that all she had to do was collect it. She shivered as she drifted over the deep water of the drop-off. The cold seeped up to surround her suspended form like a tangible shadow. Though she knew it was only a natural consequence of the mingling depths, the chill still set her teeth on edge. It felt like a warning, urging her to hurry up. She dove, wand brandished at the ready, but encountered nothing and easily looped her left arm through the golden circlet. Rigel paused for a moment to tap it with a mild sticking charm. Once assured that it would stay in place, she gave the mental equivalent of a shrug, thinking, maybe it really is that simple. After all, there's every chance the dangers of the lake itself will be enough of a challenge. Rigel spun slowly in a circle to orient herself toward the next item. Both remaining dots on her tracking bracelet were relatively far away, blinking in the outermost ring of distance markers, but one was slightly closer. She set off toward that one, her course taking her away from the shallow field of underwater grass, out over the drop-off. Colder water pressed into her despite the gillyweed's thermoregulating effects. The light of her headband did nothing to penetrate the fathoms below her, and though she was loath to leave the little sunlight that had filtered down to her present depth, Rigel knew the odds of her next item being suspended conveniently in the water were slim. She dove, water sliding over her still slimed skin like air under the wings of a bird. Occasionally, something flickered at the edge of her vision, but for the most part she passed unmolested into the deeper trenches of the lake. If she still had ears, she'd have worried about the pressure, but they'd been sealed into something dense and muffled by the gillyweed. She felt vibrations that might have been sound with her whole body, but for the most part they were easy to block out, the white noise of the underwater world like a persistent but mostly steady thrumming deep in her bones. Rigel was halfway to her second item when the water around her fluctuated sharply and began to drag her sideways without warning. She struggled against the current and the mild panic that something she couldn't see was sucking her in. Her beam of light caught a mottled purple and red tentacle to her left and the sensation became clear. The giant squid was passing by, and she'd been caught in its undertow. She flailed inelegantly for a minute before giving in to the displacement and allowing the water to tug her sideways in the squid's wake. A curious tentacle reached out to stroke her arm as she grew near, slime meeting slime for a brief moment of surreal connection. The casual strength of its suckers pulled Rigel along for a time, as a child might drag a teddy bear aimlessly. She kept as still as she could so as not to strain anything accidentally. She doubted the squid meant any harm. It was notoriously domesticated and had never, to her knowledge, harmed a student in all the years it lived in the lake, but a creature so large could have little concept of its own strength. When it lost interest and released her, Rigel found herself somewhat off trajectory, but a great deal closer to her goal than before. Taking the luck as it came, she adjusted course and found herself approaching a sunken shipwreck. For a moment she could only stare. How in Marin's name did a shipwreck get here? The idea of the tournament organizers arranging it for dramatic effect was not out of the question, but the established algae colonies looking quite at home all over its wooden surface put doubt to it. Come to think of it, the squid was a saltwater creature, wasn't it? How had it come to be in a Scottish loch? Those deep trenches she'd passed over gained a new context if she considered the idea that the lake might contain some sort of passageway to other waters in its unfathomable reaches. Awed and a bit intimidated by the notion, Rigel had to force her attention back to the task at hand. Her tracking beacon led her into the ship's cracked hull, and she carefully slipped through the jagged jaws of broken boards. Her headlamp crawled across the waterlogged cargo hold as she scanned it slowly. She startled a school of fish and had to flatten herself against a barrel as they scarpered past. In their trailing bubbles, she found the treasure she sought. An enormous golden locket was fastened to the pole of an emerald flag, which had been fixed to one of the blown-out portholes. Rigel's webbed fingers were not up to the task of unhooking the clasp, but after tearing the heavy flag from the pole, she managed to lift it free. She settled the long chain of the locket around her neck and stuck the gaudy thing to her outer shirt with magic. Just one more item remained. The final dot on her tracker was relatively close. It took her deeper as the terrain sloped downward, toward what she suspected was the very center of the lake. An eerie glow gradually replaced the darkness in the distance, and her eyes strained to understand what she was seeing. Eventually, she understood the towering silhouettes of light in the dark to be the spiraling skyline of an underwater city. Merfolk, she realized with a touch of wonder. She knew Selkies and Merrows resided in the Black Lake, but somehow it had seemed unlikely that the tournament organizers would involve them in the task. Of course, common sense would have argued against involving the centaurs of the Dark Forest, too, so really Rigel should have expected no less. The outer limits of their settlement began as any city might, with small mud residences pocketed by neatly tended fields of lake grass. These dwellings shifted gradually to denser structures of stone as the tunnel-like streets between them gained an appreciable order. Rigel wove her way warily toward her beacon, keeping an eye out for potentially unfriendly locals. The occasional face peered out at her from a window or doorway, but, other than one scowling Selkie who brandished a low barbug at her disagreeably, none came out to either greet or impede her. As the dot on her bracelet drew close to the center, she slowed her progression. Up ahead, in the heart of the Mercity, she could see an area clear of buildings that was probably used as a town square. She darted between stone pillars cautiously. The task had been too easy. The tight feeling in her stomach made her all too reluctant to rush ahead, despite the knowledge that she was being timed. Rigel cupped her hand over the light on her headband and peered over a low stone wall into the city square. It had been cleared of vegetation completely, so nothing impeded her view of the squad of arrows floating in a loose circle as though they had any business being at the bottom of the lake. Each of them wore a red wetsuit and a bubblehead charm, which distorted their features creepily. Behind the arrows, in the center of the circle, she could see glimpses of two more people waiting, but the reason for their presence wasn't immediately clear. Where was the last item? It must be valuable, to have actual guards, she thought. Maybe one of the two figures in the center of the protective circle was holding it. Would she have to duel someone after all? She crept along the wall several meters, until she could get a better look at the two people the arrows were encircling. When she finally caught a glimpse of one of their faces, the tight feeling in her stomach redoubled. It was Owen's girlfriend, Johanna something or other. Her eyes were closed, black hair adrift, and Rigel was slow to realize the girl wasn't floating the same way the arrows were. She hung suspended, motionless, only tethered to the lake by a rope around her legs. There was no bubblehead charm on her, and for a terrible second Rigel thought she might actually be dead. Don't be stupid, Rigel admonished herself as she ducked back down behind the wall, heart pounding. What would Aras be doing guarding a dead body? She checked her wrist again, but her dot still blinked stubbornly at a distance that suggested her item was indeed within that circle of Aras. Why would Owen's girlfriend have my third item? Then it hit her. The other figure in the circle. Her heart in her throat, she darted further along the wall and looked again. There, between a burly arrow with a mustache and a woman she was vaguely sure she'd met before, Rigel saw her. Pansy. Her friend floated limply, blonde hair a halo around her pale, slack face. Rigel's limbs jerked in an aborted spasm that she only barely quashed. Anger, boiling hot, coursed through her at the sight of sweet, fragile Pansy tied like a balloon to the lake. She didn't know whose idea it was to involve the champion's friends in this bloody spectacle, didn't know whether Pansy herself had agreed to it or been taken unknowing to this fate, but she did know that someone would answer for it. Pansy didn't seem to be breathing. There was no indication as to whether she was unconscious or asleep, but when Rigel forced her eyes to peer harder through the gloom, she made out a series of numbers hanging over her head, glowing faintly, 1148. It looked like a date or a time, but it wasn't November and, no, not a date, she corrected as the fourth number changed steadily before her focused gaze, a timer. It was counting backwards. She didn't care to find out what would happen to Pansy when it reached 0. Rigel eyed the arrows with unmistakably aggressive intention. They were between her and Pansy, and that was their mistake. 8 of them and 1 of her. With a little over 10 minutes left to something, taking them head-on was out of the question. It would have to be distraction. She knew a few things about a protocol. A disturbance in the distance would not entice them to abandon the primary objective. The only thing that came before mission success was the individual safety of the squad's members, assuming the mission wasn't deemed worth the loss of life. Somehow, she doubted the tournament qualified. How to threaten their safety without actually harming any of them? If she thought about it, she could probably come up with something from DePitt's book. Something elegant. Compassionate, even. Unfortunately for the Urus, she was pressed for time and feeling a bit indignant on Pansy's behalf. Regardless of what would actually happen when the clock ran out, the mere implication that Pansy's airflow was at risk flat out infuriated her. The Urus would survive a small taste of that fear, she decided. There was a spell that healers used to transfer potions directly into a person's stomach. It wasn't ever to be used against a person's will, and Mediwizards took stringent oaths to that effect when they became licensed. Harry was not a healer, and hadn't taken any such oath. She pointed her wand at the familiar-looking woman and hesitated. The bubblehead charm made it difficult to recognize her, but Rigel was pretty sure on second look that it was Nymphadora Tonks. Sirius might take it amiss if she targeted his cousin specifically, she reflected, and adjusted her aim slightly. She didn't have a potion on hand, but, in a way, they were surrounded by a very simple one. Rigel spelled water directly into the burly Uru's bubblehead charm. Not enough to drown him, but enough, this far underwater, to terrify. It wasn't nice. It wasn't honorable. But it worked. He thrashed in panic, no doubt thinking his spell had failed, and the Urus on either side of him turned immediately to help. In the confusion, no one noticed her rope-severing charm until it was too late. Rigel summoned Pansy with a grunt of effort, and it was only the fact that the blonde girl was slightly less dense than Rigel that allowed the summons to work. If Pansy had the greater mass, Rigel would probably have flown toward her instead. The Urus did notice their hostage shooting away from them, but Rigel's spell pulled Pansy through the water faster than they could swim. Rigel shot up from behind the wall to catch her and called up a shield that emerged slightly slower than usual in the watery environment. The Urus shouted something at her, but Rigel couldn't hear them. She didn't have proper ears, and their words didn't travel the same underwater in any case. Before the Urus could shoot any spells at her, Rigel disillusioned both herself and Pansy, all the while swimming away as quickly as her finned feet would take them. She dropped the shield when she was far enough and twisted sideways to throw off their sense of where she'd gone. Then she stopped moving, letting them drift in the water with only the slightest trail of bubbles from her gills to give away their position. The Urus looked around and gestured for a time, but it was clear they were not supposed to move far from their remaining captive. As Rigel drifted upward, Pansy cradled securely in her arms, she saw Tonks carefully draining the water from her comrade's bubblehead charm. She wondered with a glance back at Johanna just where Owens was. Delacour had obviously already collected her third item, which meant Rigel really ought to be racing for the surface. The vow urged her on, but her conscience worried at her. Would the other girl be all right? She wanted to believe the tournament organizers wouldn't really hurt an innocent. They wanted dramatic stakes, to be sure, but the death of a hostage would be too far, wouldn't it? People had died before in the Triwizard tournament, though. Rigel's stomach clenched again. She couldn't just abandon the other girl. The clock above Pansy's head read, 3:34. If Owens were going to show up and claim his girlfriend from the Urus, he would have had to make an appearance by now. There was no rule against taking someone else's item. Perhaps, if she brought both girls to the surface, she could claim Owens' points, too. It was the last, brutally mercenary thought that settled the vow and kept her blood below an uncomfortable simmer as she carefully kicked her way back down toward the ring of Urus, who were now looking quite alert and annoyed. With no time to spare, she pooled magic into her wand and abandoned subtlety entirely. She sent the strongest repulsion jinx she could muster right into the middle of their ranks. Every one of them was taken by surprise as the spell exploded at their backs. They hadn't, evidently, expected her to aim a spell right next to the hostage. Underwater, the repulsion jinx looked like an ever-expanding bubble of hot water that propelled all before it, all except Johanna, who was tied securely in place. While the oars tumbled ass over kettle in every direction, Rigel made quick work of severing the dark-haired girl's tether and summoning her as well. With Pansy to anchor her, Rigel had more than enough mass to bring the girl securely to her side. As the clocks moved down from 1:25, Rigel kicked upward with all her might. The surface beckoned, light dawning just ahead, and yet no matter how fast she swam, it didn't seem to be getting any closer. She must have been much farther down than she thought. The girls were light at first, but seemed to grow heavier as the seconds ticked on. Her limbs were tiring, she thought, but as a pain made itself known in her lungs, she realized that wasn't it, rather, her gillyweed was wearing off. 30 seconds. She counted them in her head as she strained to focus on something other than the burning in her lungs, the trembling in her arms and legs. Rigel made it to 20, and spots crept over her vision. She felt herself twitch against the need to gasp. This wasn't working. She had to get the girls to the surface somehow. Rigel readied herself to use the last of her strength propelling the two girls upward. If she pushed with everything she had, they might make it, even if the effort sank her own chances. The vow simmered angrily in her veins, just as something in her rebelled, though it took a fraction of a second to realize it wasn't her. Are you a witch or not? Don't just die, stupid. Dom. What? A spell, the words and shape and feel of the magic, slammed into her conscious mind so hard she saw stars. Ascendio. 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 Her wand reacted, whether to her command or Dom's she didn't think to wonder until later. Rigel clung to the two girls with everything she had as they shot to the surface like a cork coming out of a shaken butterbeer. She gasped, heaved and coughed as she took in water along with the air, then gasped some more. It was several deep breaths before she noticed she was not the only one gasping. Pansy was flailing, barely treading water as her eyes darted this way and that, a decidedly panicked glaze to them. The American girl was faring slightly better, craning her long neck around worriedly but keeping her head and chest above the lake just fine. Pansy, it's all right. Rigel held out a hand to comfort her friend, and Pansy latched on for a moment before letting it go and slapping the water once more in sheer fright. Rigel, she gasped. What on earth, what's going on? Why are you, slimy? We're in the lake, Rigel said, her voice a bit hoarse from the water she'd swallowed. The fourth task in the tournament. I had to come get you, but I did, and we're going to be fine now, okay? No, she said brokenly, panting for air. No, I'm not feeling fine, Rigel. I can't swim very well. She could see that. Pansy had her chin tilted all the way back to keep her nose and mouth as far from the water as possible, and the school robes she was wearing were only exacerbating the problem. Rigel looked around for help, but of course there was no one. They were in the middle of the lake, and the shore was at least a mile away. Bloody buggering planning on Bagman and Crouch's behalf. Hey, Black Johanna cut in, her American accent thick. Where's Jacob? What happened to him? I don't know, she said honestly. I collected you myself because the time clock above your head was almost out. The what? Johanna was still looking around as though ONs might pop up any moment. Are you saying Jacob is still down there? Rigel shook her head impatiently. I don't know. Let's get to shore and we can find out. I'm not leaving him, Johanna protested, her wide grey eyes horrified. He could be in trouble. How can you help if he is? Rigel asked, trying to be reasonable. Pansy's movements were getting increasingly uncoordinated. Owens has a monitoring headband, same as me. She gestured to the green band on her forehead. Everyone on land will know exactly where he is and how he's doing. Please, will you help me get my friend to safety? Johanna's expression was torn, but she could evidently see that Pansy was not exaggerating her inability. Yeah, okay. Listen, girl, you've got to calm down. Understand? Rigel could see Pansy gritting her teeth as she replied, a bit breathless. I am trying. No one told me I would be swimming, however. She made a valiant attempt at slowing her movements to something more controlled, but fear crept into her expression when the more measured strokes caused her to sink a few inches. Rigel, she stuttered. I would like to get out of the water now. So would I, thought Rigel, but barring someone coming along on a broom and lifting us out, hang on, I can do that much. Pan, I'm going to levitate you, she said firmly. Don't struggle. She pointed her wand at her friend and said, Wingardium Leviosa. Pansy stilled her arms as Rigel's spell carefully lifted her partway out of the water. Once she was only in waist deep, Pansy took several slow breaths and said, Thank you, Rigel. Here. She took the wrist of Rigel's wand hand in her own to steady the spell. You can't keep that up forever, though. What are we supposed to do from here? Rigel, who was focused on keeping Pansy semi-aloft while treading water herself with her free hand, didn't notice Johanna swimming closer until the American girl tapped her in the forehead sharply. Hello. People watching on those giant TV screens. The girl scowled into the runic array from a foot in front of Rigel and clapped her hand on Rigel's shoulder to keep her from moving away. Now would be a great time to send someone to come and... Her words cut off as a hook jerked all three of them into non-being. They reappeared in the center of the Quidditch pitch, sopping wet and stunned by the shock of having been force-apparated without warning. No, not apparated, she recognized the magic receding into her headband as a portkey. A crowd roared down at them from the stands, and all Rigel could do was stare uncomprehendingly until her wits came back to her. The noise, after an hour of near silence in the lake, was overwhelming. Rigel wanted to clap her hands over her ears and shut her eyes and make everything disappear, but of course she couldn't. This was the Triwizard Tournament, and she had a role to play. -0. DM. -0. I'm going to kill them. Draco barely paid the words any attention. It was not the first time he'd heard them since Pansy's face had appeared, ghost-white and devoid of all life, in Rigel's transmission mirror. Alden had said it faintly the first time, then again when Pansy's head broke the surface and they could see how utterly unprepared she'd been to come to in those surroundings. Now, watching her rebuild her dignity piece by piece with trembling pride down on the pitch, the words were almost a growl. I mean, I'm really going to. Pansy doesn't need us to kill someone right now, Edmund rumbled. Despite his reserved words, Draco could hear an anger at least as great as Alden's, maybe greater, running hot in his tone. She needs to be checked out by a Mediwitch, and then she needs comfort and familiarity and calm. I can calmly kill them. Just go see to her, already, Draco snapped. His eyes were fixed on his best friends, and he'd never felt more helpless. He wanted to go to them himself, but didn't trust himself not to explode in a pathetic mess of unresolved impotent fear and rage. Why aren't you? Edmund asked, though he was already moving past Draco out of their box. I will in a minute. Don't tell me you want to watch Owens try to figure out his third item is already gone, Alden said, scorn in his voice. Draco tore his eyes from Rigel just long enough to raise the seventh year with a look. I will. In a minute. They left him there, and Draco rewarded his restraint with a muttered curse. Everything about the fourth task hacked him off. First, Snape lured them away from Rigel right before it started with a story that turned out to be made up specifically to rope Pansy into this blasted nightmare. Of course she had agreed, when the obvious alternative was Draco. Pansy was as protective of them as they were of her. Snape made it sound innocuous. She would sleep through the entire thing, he'd said. No harm would come to her. Except mental and emotional harm weren't factored into the calculation, were they? Draco let out a sharp breath. He needed to get his shit together. Pansy and Rigel needed his support, not his anger. Well, Pansy not so much, he amended as Edmund and Alden collected her from the field. They wrapped the soaking girl in blankets and bundled her away to the medic tent. Rigel watched her go until she'd disappeared behind the canvas, the very picture of a concerned beau. Draco wondered if Rigel knew how they had cast him and Pansy. The contrast between Owens and his girl was unmistakable. Owens. What an idiot. Even now he was swimming back toward the Merfolk settlement, both of his other items secured and not a care in the world. Draco wasn't interested in watching that prat swim, though. His emotions thoroughly under control at last, Draco made his own way down from the stands. Rigel was still standing in the middle of the pitch, dripping and probably tempting the mother of all colds. No one had even fetched him a blanket yet. Draco grabbed two on his way past the Mediwitch tent and jogged the rest of the way to where his friend stood. Rigel looked a little lost, though it was obvious he didn't mean to. He'd taken off his headband and the tracking bracelet, but otherwise remained as he had since leaping into the lake. Rigel. The boy turned at the sound of his name, a smile finding easy perch on his face as he caught sight of Draco approaching. "Dre," he said, his voice almost a sigh. "Come to keep me company until the scores are announced." "Come to keep you from catching pneumonia," more like, he said, gesturing to the towels in his hands. "Here, you're dripping all over the place and the grass doesn't need watering." Rigel chuckled as he took a towel and rubbed it over his head quickly. The rest of him was treated the same, and Draco manfully did not watch, even though a voice in his head kept pointing out that this was the most he'd ever seen of Rigel's skin. His friend wore sweats to exercise and always changed in the bathroom. The sight of long, muscular alabaster limbs was almost indecent, somehow. Not that he was looking. Rigel had made his feelings clear, well, mostly clear, on the subject of Draco's attraction, and he was trying, saw Laser help him, to respect that. He did note with some distant confusion that nowhere did Rigel carry signs of an unusual skin condition. Then again, perhaps it wasn't visible at the moment. Maybe his friend had applied a glamour for the task. That sounded like something Rigel would do. "Thanks, Dre. I do feel much warmer now." Rigel let one of the towels hang about his shoulders and secured the other around his waist. Draco was silently grateful, as the distracting way those wet shorts clung to everything was a painful taunt in each accidental glimpse. "So, how'd I do?" Draco stared at him. "How'd you do?" "Rigel, how do you think you did?" "I don't know," Rigel said, shrugging. "I assume Delacour got back before me, since her hostage was already gone when I got to the Mercity." "That's not a word," he began, but then he shook his head. "No, never mind. Rigel, Delacour quit the task as soon as she saw her sister. She'd only collected one of her other items when she got to the settlement, but she took her sister straight to the surface and forfeited the rest of her time." "Oh." Rigel blinked slowly. "I hadn't thought that the others might get to their hostages first. I supposed in a way I was lucky." "Lucky?" The word came out slightly strangled, despite Draco's best effort to keep it even. Rigel said, nodding blithely. "I mean, lucky that I didn't know about Pansy being down there until I'd already found the other two items. If I'd come across her first, I don't know what I would have done." "You'd have done what Delacour did," Draco said firmly. He was sure of it, Rigel was the guy who put others first, period. The dark-haired boy frowned uncertainly. "I don't know if I could have," he said softly. "I have to do my best in every task. I can flex a little as long as I still have a good chance at winning, but giving up prematurely, I don't know." Draco's breath caught as what Rigel was saying sunk in. Could his deal with Riddle have made him choose winning over Pansy? If so, then it could make him choose winning over anything. Somehow, that hadn't fully registered until now. He didn't know what to say in the face of such a horrifying thought. Rigel was rambling on without his input, however. "Saw Laser. All the cryptic instructions at the beginning make sense now. That's why there's no time limit, because it's a choice they want us forced to make. Save your friend and forfeit the remaining points, or risk your friend to try and get the other two items before their clock runs out. That's what Owens did," Draco said. "He came to the city first, then dithered around and wasted time trying to stall Delacour from getting to her person. It was incredibly idiotic. Not only did he waste his own time, but when Delacour realized he was attempting to keep her from her sister, she snapped. Why anyone would purposely knock off a Vila, even a part Vila, is beyond me. So that's why he's still down there," Rigel said, glancing up at the screen. Owens had reached the city, only to find his girlfriend gone. The transmission mirror relayed his conversation with the Urus, who explained that one of the other champions had escorted his girlfriend to the surface, and that the time on that item had run out in any case. Rigel looked over to where the girl in question was huddled near the medic tent, a troubled frown on her face. "What would have happened when the time ran out?" Rigel asked quietly. "Did they explain while we were down there?" Draco nodded. "When the clock reached 0, the Urus were to portkey them out. So you'd lose the opportunity to get points for collecting them, but they wouldn't be at risk of drowning." Rigel grimaced. "I knew I was being overdramatic. My head wasn't entirely clear. All I could think was that I'd put nothing past Riddle and his little band of psychopaths. It came across as noble, Draco said, shrugging uncomfortably. You look like a saint compared to Owens. And you got all 3 items, where Delacour has only 2. She finished faster, though, Rigel said thoughtfully. How did she get past the errors? Draco wanted to laugh, but also to cry. Rigel, she didn't have to get past them. The errors weren't there to stop you from taking Pansy. Rigel stared at him, completely nonplussed. What? No, they were guarding them. From the mer people, Draco said slowly, and the giant squid and the grindillos and who knows what else down there, the errors were protecting the girls. Delacour swam right up and demanded her sister. They handed her over and even helped untie her. The pale boy shook his head, bewildered. Why didn't they say so? They yelled it at you, Rigel. Right after you tried to drown one of them. Rigel flushed. The gillyweed sealed my ears. I couldn't hear anything while I was underwater. Anyway, I wasn't trying to drown him. Just scare him a little. That explained it. Trust Rigel to think he was meant to fight 8 fully grown wizards for his friend's life. It says something that diplomatic negotiation didn't even occur to you, Draco drawled. Then again, it said about their country's law enforcement that Rigel had succeeded. Twice. If you had stopped to say hi, incidentally, the errors would have explained that your headband would act as a portkey to shore when you surfaced, as long as you and your passengers were all in physical contact. It had been agonizing to watch them flounder in the water trying to figure out how to get Pansy to shore when all they had to do was touch hands for half a second. Rigel scowled. Well, if someone you cared about was tied up at the bottom of a lake and 8 guys with wands were standing around them, would you ask questions before shooting? Draco wisely did not dignify that with an answer. Owens and the squad of errors appeared not far from them on the pitch, and Rigel grimaced. I suppose I should explain, the boy muttered. Or Cousin Dora will think I'm a psychopath. He jogged over to where the errors were, and Draco let him go alone. It gave him time to watch Owen's girlfriend march across the lawn like a Valkyrie going into battle. Smack. The whole stadium went quiet as the incensed girl slapped her boyfriend across the face. The transmission hadn't stopped on his headband yet, and the sound echoed from the mirror like a crack of thunder. You left me. How dare you, Jacob? Do you know how worried I was when I surfaced? Only to be told that you were still swimming after some buried treasure instead of taking me to safety. The whole stadium could hear the argument, but Owens, demonstrating for the nth time that morning what a complete idiot he was, didn't take off his headband before firing back. I knew you'd be fine. Draco winced. Even he knew that was not the right thing to say. Fine. At the bottom of a lake. Anything could have happened to me, Jake. That giant squid could have eaten me for all you know. That's what the errors are there for, Owens said defensively. Draco thought he was rather missing the point. I should have gone back to Ilvermorny instead of letting you convince me to stay in this miserable, cold place. We're through, Jacob. You hear me? Through. Everyone heard her, of course, and Draco was sure the angry little Spitfire was well pleased about that. Girls likes a bit of drama when they were upset. Rigel rejoined him after finishing his conversation with Andromeda's spawn. Did you avoid a blood feud? He asked politely. Rigel grinned. Tonks thought it was hilarious once I explained. The guy whose bubblehead I messed with was less than pleased, but he did admit it was a good lesson. Did you know all 8 of them are trainees? Apparently, the head of training, Aramudi, volunteered them for the task. He must really dislike them, Draco said. Before Rigel could give his opinion either way, Bagman finally put them all out of their misery and announced, "Thank you ladies and gentlemen for your patience. With the 4th task now concluded, it is time to hear what the judges have to say." In today's task, champions were tested on the following criteria: efficiency in conquering the aquatic element out of 10 points, number of overall items retrieved out of 25, and moral fiber out of 15 points. Draco blinked, taken aback. Moral fiber was only 5 points in the first task. Now it's more than the magic you used to survive underwater is worth. Rigel's face took on a cynical cast as he said quietly, "It's worth more points because Riddle is sure of his ability to predict my actions, now." There's a reason my items were, in order of distance from the starting point, also the order that would prevent me from even having to tackle the morality issue at all. That was exactly what Draco would do, if he were trying to rig the tournament for Rigel to win. If anything, Draco was a little grateful that someone was playing to Rigel's strengths. Somehow, he didn't think that was what his friend wanted to hear, though. Fleur Delacour finished first with 2 items retrieved in 35 minutes. Bagman went on. She used the bubblehead charm to sufficient effect. For conquering the underwater environment, 8 points. 4 items retrieved, 19 points. Due to her determination to retrieve her living item post-haste, Miss Delacour receives 15 points for moral fiber. The total score, 42 out of 50. Delacour looked shocked from where she was huddled around her tiny silver-haired clone. No doubt she'd expected to be slapped with the book for abandoning the task in favor of getting her sister to safety. Archeress Rigel Black finished second with all 3 items retrieved in 60 minutes. He used Gillyweed to superb effect, not only overcoming but adapting to the aquatic nature of the task. For that, he receives full marks in the first 2 categories. Upon discovering the ominous time limit associated with the living items, Black put himself to additional trouble in order to recover both remaining persons from the depths. For moral fiber, therefore, he also receives full marks. Mr. Black's total score is a resounding 50 points. Well done, Mr. Black. Rigel's mouth fell open. Full marks. What are they playing at? Delacour doesn't get anything for reaching the hostages before me. And I get extra points for unnecessarily, it turns out, stealing Owen's 3rd item. Draco shook his head with a small smile. You can't pretend to be surprised, Rigel. You already admitted the whole thing is rigged. They could be less obvious about it, he grumbled. The crowd was unabashedly in favor of the verdict. Most had by now heard about the piece that Skeeter published in the paper that morning. There could be no doubt that Rigel Black, the charitable champion, would receive full marks for moral fiber on any scale. Rigel was looking up at the stands with a helpless frown. Draco gave a fond sigh and said, bracingly, I know this isn't the way you would prefer to win, but don't forget that you do want to win this, Rigel. Be glad that your goals are still on track. You'll have time when it's all over to assuage your conscience in other ways. Rigel nodded slowly. Thank you, Draco. You're right. It's stupid to be upset that things are going my way. That wasn't exactly what Draco meant, but Bagman had given up on the cheers dying down and begun to simply shout over the crowd's roar. Jacob Owens finished last with 2 items in 75 minutes. He used the very rare Liber Espire potion to impressive effect. Draco saw Rigel's head whip around in shock. There's no way, the boy muttered, staring at Owens like he's just sprouted wings. What? Tell you later, Rigel said, waving the question away before it could form. Will receive 10 points. 4 items retrieved, 12 points. While Mr. Owens reached the living captives the quickest, he chose to attempt retrieval of his remaining 2 items before returning to escort his person to the surface. As a result, and regardless of Mr. Black's actions in relation to his living item, Mr. Owens returned after the time limit for that item had expired. In terms of the implied scenario, his living item is considered lost, and in choosing to pursue the remaining treasure he demonstrated self-interest and ambition above concern for the well-being of another. Mr. Owens will therefore receive no points for moral fiber. His total is 22 points out of 50. Draco winced as Owens' girlfriend, no longer magnified through the mirrors but nevertheless exceedingly strident, shouted that he was a self-serving snake who deserved to lose the entire tournament. Snakes always get a bad name, Rigel said, somewhat tiredly. Pretty cruel of the organizers to use his girlfriend, in any case. That was asking for this kind of fallout. I'm glad they didn't take Harry, come to think of it. It would have been too difficult to move her from America, Draco said with a shrug. Delacour's sister was already going to be here, since she hasn't missed a task yet, and Owens' heiress was right there for the taking, of course. Is Pansy all right? Rigel asked, his attention drifting to the medical tent now that the scores had been announced. A bit of anger crept back into his expression as he added, she was trying not to show it, but I could tell she was terrified, Dre. She had a bad experience swimming near her parents' estate in France as a child, Draco explained. They told us she would be asleep through the whole thing, which is the only reason she agreed. I suppose it lent a better sense of drama if the witches awoke when you crossed the finish line, so to speak. Rigel's eyes found Lord Riddle as he was leaving the judge's box. His voice was a dangerous growl as he said, "Then I hope the puppet master is pleased with his little show. He only gets 2 more, after all. -0. TR. -0. He was not, precisely, pleased. The last thing he wanted to do after a successful stratagem was sour the day with unpleasantries. The odious chore of reminding his followers exactly where they stood in line was necessary, however. The simpler the wizard, the more often he needed reminding, and he had left this particular correcting too long. Barty was waiting, as instructed, in the boathouse. For a moment, Tom allowed a faint, nostalgic smile to tug at his lips. He'd conducted much business, in his early days on the rise, in this very boathouse. Its walls were witness to things, plans and decisions, and corrections, too, that few still living would be able to relate. He paused inside the door, taking in the twitchy, sullen-faced man staring out the window at the black lake. Despite being a wizard grown, Barty looked much the same as he had that first day, when he'd come to Tom begging like a dog for scraps in Bellatrix's wake. It had been nearly 14 years since the favor that sealed the boy, now a man, into his service. 14 years of loyal subordination, and now this. At his pointed footstep, Barty spun and dropped into a low bow. "My lord," he said deferentially. His restless tongue made an appearance as his eyes roved. "Was the task to your liking?" "It was, surprising, Barty," he said silkily. "Did I not express the desire to have Draco Malfoy stand in for Black's third item?" Barty twitched and sculled. "The Malfoys have enough pull. Looks better, anyway, to have a pretty girl on the post, doesn't it?" Tom sneered at the fool's transparent motivations. "I'm aware that the Parkinsons are your closer cousins. No doubt you wanted to share in their prestige, being connected so openly to the popular pureblood champion. Where you miscalculated, Barty, was in forgetting that it was not your decision to make. You work for me. This is my tournament. You gave me creative license," Barty whined. "Too much, it seems." He drew himself up to his full height and said the next words very clearly. "You overstep of late." The silence stretched between them, Barty's fear, growing steadily, a trembling, wind-buffeted thing. Into that silence, he snapped, "Were you behind Greyback's little Joyce-Spree in the first task? The blood wall in the second?" The whites in Barty's eyes confessed his sins like a caterwauling charm. The only question he really wanted answered, however, was, "Did you honestly think I wouldn't notice, Barty? That I couldn't perceive how your devotion strays?" My lord," Barty stuttered. "I don't." "Oh, Barty, you really don't think much of me, even after all our years of association?" "I always." "No." He softened his voice until Barty had to lean closer to catch each syllable. "You should have come to me, when you began to doubt. Did I not arrange personally for your father's disgrace and demotion, that you and others like you might be freed from his oppressive anti-dark agenda? Have I not been a good lord to you, all these years? You have always pushed for our liberation from the tyranny of discrimination," Barty said carefully. He never could quite cage the whine in the back of his voice. "It's just, change is slow, my lord. Should we not push harder?" So that was the problem. Plain, predictable impatience. He resisted the urge to sneer. "Push harder?" he asked, no inflection in his tone. Emboldened by a lack of swift correction, Barty licked his lips and nodded, half to himself. "Yes, we must strike out boldly. Harder, and faster, too. It is the only way to shake up society, to shake down the forbidden fruit they keep locked away out of fear and take it for ourselves. Take care you don't cut down the tree that feeds you while you're at it, Barty." "But it's working." Barty burst out. "The masses are paying attention. After the World Cup." Tom's temper ignited. "You admit to being one of the masked revelers, too. Idiot child. I have not worked so long for credibility only to allow brash young fools to give in to a base desire for anarchy the very hour our victory comes into sight. We are this close, Barty." He could not help but see that the uncomprehending mulishness in Barty's eyes. When Rigel Black wins the Triwizard Tournament, the pure-blood argument will be irrefutable. Our political power will solidify under the banner of accepted truth, the way forward for society paved inexorably by us. Barty muttered something resentfully, and Tom made an irritated jerk of his chin. What was that? It isn't enough, Barty repeated, more firmly. They should be punished for the way they've treated us. They should bleed. Blood will not solve the problem. It took a hard-earned well of fortitude to disguise his exasperation as forbearance. Don't you think I considered that? It is a pipe dream. Revolution inevitably leads to uncontrolled depravity with no clear-cut agenda. No nuanced strategy can survive that environment. Chaos rules. The only certain result is that every friend to common decency and morality rallies against us, don't you see? Tom pinned Barty with all the ice in his gaze. Tell me you understand this, Barty. I need you, of all people, to see the big picture clearly. It would be extremely tedious to navigate a sudden change on the tournament planning committee, especially with only 2 tasks remaining. If the fool would not see reason, however, Tom had every intention of replacing him. He could afford no rogue pieces on his board at this stage in the game. Barty's face betrayed his struggle, but in the end, he bowed his head. I understand, my lord, he said. You are wise, of course. Your plans never fail. Forgive me. Tom allowed his uncertainty to fester. You will renounce these radicals, Barty. No member of the SOW will be party to that pathetic fear-mongering campaign. Its leader will be dealt with soon enough, he promised, adding with a thread of steel, the last thing I want is to lose you to a doomed cause. Barty gulped. Yes, my lord. He bent into a deep bow and said, head hanging, I don't deserve your mercy. That is the nature of mercy, he said. Satisfied that Barty's foolhardy foray into violent protest had been corrected, his mood took a cautious upswing. The next task will be exactly to my specifications, Barty. Yes, my lord. Whatever you say. -0, 0, 0. -0, 0. -0. End of chapter 11.